village had been quiet all day, as if the thatch itself were holding its breath, and when evening finally arrived, it came on like a soft cloak, grey along the hedges, silver on the pond, a faint dusting of ash in the fields, where the last sheaves had stood. He walked the lane with a candle cupped in both hands, wind idling through the fingers like a sleepy cat, following the old path to the yew tree by the churchyard wall, where the vigil of All Hallows was kept each year. There, under branches twisted like careful script, people gathered without hurry, faces gentle in the candlelight, each flame a small prayer, speaking in a language older than the tongue. The bell at the chapel door gave a low, woolen note, compline calling them toward the little nave, with its soot-dark beams, while along the green a child tugged at a turnip lantern, its crude grin leaking light, and an old woman pressed tiny soul cakes into waiting palms with the whisper, "For all faithful departed," her voice thin as parchment. No one spoke loudly. This was not a night for clamour, but for listening, for letting the mind drift between names remembered and the great hush that holds them, and the yew, which had seen more winters than any living villager, seemed to lean closer, its resin scent like ink lines drawn across time. Inside, the monk with the ledger, brown-eyed, patient, a man who counted not coins but candles, opened his book and traced each name with a slow finger. There were saints proclaimed by Rome, and saints known only to kitchens, fields, and forges, and a hush fell when he paused at a page water-stained from last year's rain, as if even the book sighed at the thought of what is kept and what escapes. Somewhere in the rafters a little owl made its penny coin call, and the villagers, pleased by the omen, small and round and ordinary, settled into the choir stalls where carved leaves and mischievous faces peeped from the wood. The old carver, long buried, had given the pews their quiet jokes, so that even on this solemn night the benches smiled in secret, and yet beneath the gentle solemnity there ran a thread like a stream under ice, a knowledge that this night had older shadows as well as newer light. Some said these days were tempered steel, forged from Samhain's dusk and Christian dawn together, and though scholars would later debate whether the harvest fires had truly braided into the bell-rung vigil, the villagers simply kept both memories in their hands, a loaf set by the door for the travelling soul, a bead worked between the fingers for the named dead. They sang low psalms, a murmur like tide against worn stones, and the bell gave another breath of sound. Candles nodded in the draught, blessing everyone with small golden bows. A boy who had been sick the previous winter, now thin but bright-eyed, asked his mother if the holy ones could hear through the wind. She answered without looking away from the altar, "If wind can carry smoke, it can carry a name." And the boy, satisfied, breathed on his candle so softly that it trembled like a thought. Near the door stood the steward of the night watch, cloak smelling faintly of rain, reciting under his breath the places he must cross after the prayers, the lane by the mill, the moor's first gate, the path where a black hound had once been seen and turned out to be only mist curling from a ditch. He was brave, of course, but on All Hallows it is not bravery that keeps men steady, only the sense that one walks with a company larger than sight. Outside, the hills carried the last memory of sunrise, like a bruise fading. Beyond them, farms tucked themselves in with the care of old people folding blankets. The candles, taken from the church after Compline, were set along the wall beneath the yew, and there the talk became the soft kind, of harvest owed and paid, of a travelling piper rumoured to be on the north road, of young sheep born late and blessed to live, Someone spoke of the old plague years, carefully, the way one speaks of a winter that once laid heavy hands on the valley. There was no fear left in it, only the steady gratitude of those who had learned to count the minutes of peace. A basket passed with apples and little coins for the poor, and the faces in the candlelight looked like weathered icons, lined, chipped, made holy by wear. Down the lane, mummers would later pull linen masks over their hair and make their slow, comic walk from cottage to cottage, and there would be smiling, and the kind of fright that leaves no bruise, just laughter in its wake. For now, though, the night held stillness like a chalice. The priest, his voice not much louder than the bees had been in summer, offered the blessing, and even those who knew every word felt the blessing as if for the first time. The smoke from the censer climbed as carefully as a ladder, and, because it is a thing smoke loves to do, it found the beams and read them like a book. In the ledger, the monk added a final name, a newcomer to the village who had died with little family. He wrote it with the same care as if the name had been carved at the cathedral door, for on this night no one lacked kin. The bell sounded once more, and they carried their flames away, not to banish darkness, which is a companion, but to teach it gentleness. And if the wind rose then, it rose slowly, turning the hedges into whispers, and the pond into hammered pewter, and if someone far off answered with the faintest of horns, it was only the next village greeting this one across the fields. The yew kept all these small things in its resin heart, remembering more than it told. And beyond the churchyard, where the cloister stones cooled under moonlight, there came the first echo of something older stirring, soft as wool, patient as tide, drawing the night toward doors that would open quietly, one after another, as if a careful hand were paging through the dark. After the candles were carried home, and the ewer shadow lay like quiet ink across the churchyard, the night folded inward to the cloister, where stone remembered footsteps the way a shell remembers the sea. In that enclosure, small as a garden kept by careful hands, the brothers moved with their lanterns, turnips hollowed and carved not as jeers at darkness, but as little faces of patience, their light breathing in and out as the wind rearranged itself along the arches. There had been years, the old prior whispered, when the hilltop fires burned bright on this eve, before winter's doorway, a harvest's last warm shout against the cold. Whether those flames were called Samhain by ancestors, or simply the making of courage by grandmothers, no one could say with certainty, and in that uncertainty lay a kindness, for it allowed both memory and mass to sit together on the bench of the heart. Scholars in later centuries would smooth their papers and argue over dates and roots. Was this song older than that prayer? Did the church's bell tame the ancient bonfire, or did it learn to ring in time with it? But here, within the cloister's hush, the question was gentler. What offerings comfort the living, and what lamps help the dead to find their names in our mouths? The brothers passed from arch to arch, lips moving with the psalms, their voices scarcely louder than the moths nosing the flame. A novice paused by the lion carved on a capital, its stone eye softened by centuries of looking, and wondered aloud whether the ghost of a shepherd might sit with the ghost of a bishop, if both found the same pool of light. Light makes no distinctions, murmured the sacrist, and the novice, warmed by that thought, walked on with steps that disturbed nothing but a ribbon of dust. Beyond the cloister wall, the village had its own echoing rites. A door left ajar with a cup of milk on the threshold, a round of bread marked with a cross and a sprig of rosemary, a lane where children, hooded against the chill, carried their comic masks and sang simple verses for soul cakes. Some would say the soul itself travelled on such nights, finding familiar windows the way birds find old rooftops. Others held that it was the living who wandered, their love walking out ahead of them like a lantern, lighting a path across the boundary that breath cannot cross. In the library, a monk lifted a wooden cover and opened an older book whose edges showed a winter's gnawing. There, between prayers, some distant brother had tucked a slip of birch bark with a drawing. 2 circles, one dark, one bright, lightly touching like coins in a palm. And beneath, a note in a hand, both steady and shy. Where they meet, mercy grows. He smiled at the quiet theology and replaced the bark with the care one gives to feathers. Then he looked through the narrow window slit and saw not fires leaping, but the humbler brightness of cottage hearths, each a steady tongue speaking warmth into the season's mouth. In the passage by the chapter house, an old bell hung from an iron bracket, retired from the tower when its voice had cracked. Tonight, the prior let the youngest novice touch it with a finger, and the thin silver reply it made was like the memory of water in a dry stream bed. They spoke together of the names written that evening in the ledger, the potter who once mended roof tiles with more patience than pay, the midwife who kept a willow whistle in her pouch for frightened children, the foreign tinker who smiled at every gate and fixed hinges while humming a tune no one knew, so that when their prayers rose, they rose textured, like cloth in which many hands had left small, blessed imperfections. And then the wind changed. It came round the angle of the transept, as softly as a cat that has decided to share the chair, and down the corridor it carried a scent of apples and wood smoke, a sweetness sharpened by the faintest bite of frost. The brothers paused, heads bent, as if listening to an elder, for everyone felt that turning of the season, the way the world draws breath before the darker months, the way doors close more carefully, the way stories lengthen like shadows to keep company with the long nights. A lay brother from the mill arrived with flour on his sleeves and news of the green, mummers practising behind the byre, a fiddler testing a tune with more confidence than skill, and 3 children who, when asked what they feared on such a night, confessed cheerfully to none of the expected spirits, only to the sternness of their fathers if they stayed out past prayers. Laughter breathed through the cloister like a low tide and made the lamps seem brighter, and as the night settled deeper, the prior offered a word not of command but of invitation, a reminder that every hearth in the valley belonged to the same sky, every name to the same listening. He asked for the doors to be left on the latch, the threshold swept, and at least one candle placed where the glass could carry it outward. A witness for any traveller, visible, even if no traveller came. If you, quiet listener, are keeping company with this hour, where are you joining from? And what time is it by your window? If the story has soothed the day's edges for you, consider, whenever your eyes are heavy and your heart is curious, subscribing to the entire history, so that these gentle paths of the past can find you again in the evenings to come. In the refectory, they poured small cups of spiced ale and shared the last sweet apples, each bite a crisp memory of sun. And in that warm, plain room, the notion of Samhain did not feel foreign or forbidden, but like a relative who speaks another dialect, understood when the fire is low and the stories are long. The novice, growing bolder, asked whether the saints minded sharing their vigil with old country ghosts. The prior, who was a gardener at heart, said that good earth has always welcomed mixed seed, and time knows how to sort the harvest in its own hour. Somewhere near the gatehouse, a gust pressed the heavy door and made it breathe, out, in, like a sleeping creature. The old bell hummed once, thin as a thread of moonlight, and the lanterns along the cloister walk leaned their flames toward the dark as if listening. No apparition stepped through. No omen cast its long finger across the stones. There was only the patient weaving of custom and care, of psalm and humble superstition, making a garment for the village to wear through winter. And when the last lamp was shaded and the corridor sank to velvet, a small, almost merry tapping sounded at the outer door. 3 soft knocks, spaced like the beats of a cautious heart. And the latch, kind as an old friend, lifted of its own accord into the expectant hush. The door opened, not with drama, but with the soft capitulation of wood that has learned the shape of many hands, and there on the step stood 3 small figures in linen masks, mummers, humble as sparrows, each carrying a shallow basket with a twist of rosemary tucked at the rim. The tallest held up a turnip lamp whose grin was more hopeful than frightening, and in the pooling light one could see that they had chalked little stars upon their sleeves. They bowed like miniature pilgrims and sang in thin, careful voices a souling rhyme. The valley had known, longer than memory admits, a request for cakes, a blessing for the hearth, a promise of prayers traded for crumbs. The prior's smile was a weathered thing, made gentle by years. He led them into the low antechamber where the stone kept the day's warmth like a held breath, and set before them a plate of small round breads pricked with a cross, as if to remind the mouth to speak kindly before it eats, and a dish of sliced apple that gleamed like coins. The boys' masks bobbed with gratitude, and when they lifted the linen to bite, their faces were as ordinary and holy as cold fingers warmed at a kettle. They spoke in quick whispers of the green, of the fiddler who had finally found the tune, and of a dog that might have been black as legend, or merely black as night, its tail a metronome at the edge of the common. And the brothers, listening, let their minds hold both possibilities, like a candle holds 2 shadows. Somewhere between bites, the smallest mummer recited the names he had promised to remember. His grandmother who mended pockets with secret threads, a shepherd who whistled the sun up even on clouded days, a sailor whose postcard from a bright foreign harbour had arrived after his ship came home without him. The sacrist nodded and added the names to the ledger with a care that did not distinguish between parchment and breath. Then the boys, now bolder, asked to touch the old retired bell, and when their knuckles brushed it, the silver ghost of sound that answered was like frost, learning the edges of a leaf. The prior, amused, told them a measured tale, how some say the Dans Macabre once traced a circle along the abbey wall in a year when the plague spoke too loudly, that a painter, unknown, unproud, brushed skeletons holding hands with kings and millers and children, not to frighten the living into obedience, but to teach them the grammar of tenderness. And is it true? One boy breathed, crumbs bright upon his mouth. The prior, who had learned to love uncertainty the way a gardener loves rain that may or may not arrive, said that truth sometimes wears several coats, and the important part is the warmth. So the boys, satisfied, put their masks back on as if donning patience. Out in the yard, the wind was turning the world by gentle degrees, and the clouds moved like sheep that knew their fold. The brothers carried lanterns along the cloister walk, laying down corridors of light that did not so much push back the dark as invite it to sit closer to behave. A lay sister came from the kitchen with a basket of spice cakes, and the smell of nutmeg and clove braided itself with the applewood smoke, until the air tasted like a memory you could chew. She told of a cottage door nailed with 3 iron studs to keep mischief from the latch, and how mischief, being a creature of stories, simply chose the window instead and left only laughter. In the refectory, they spoke of saints and neighbours together, of a woman who had taught travellers to read the sky by geese, of a hermit whose advice had been mostly to drink water and tell the truth, of a saint whose bone in a silver reliquary seemed to reduce fevers and increase gossip in equal measure. And someone said that perhaps miracles are just the manners of love when it puts on a coat suitable for the weather. Outside, a cart creaked past, its wheels marking the lane with patient half-moons. A man at the reins lifted 2 fingers in a night's benediction, and from the cart bed a sack answered with the muffled clink of bottles, cider for the green, most likely, and a little for courage where courage was thinning. The brothers would walk to the edge of the moor. Later, they decided to stand by the gate and listen to the sort of silence that contains 1,000 small voices, reed and owl, peat and pooling water, the old road's memory of feet. For now, the librarian brought forth a vellum scrap, whose margins wore a pilgrim's constellation of thumbprints. In the neat slope of a long dead hand was a line about All Hallows, a door at which both the living and the dead are guests, and Charity the host. They read it as one reads a fire, forward, back and again, until the words warmed the chambers behind their ribs. If you too are visiting this low-lit hour, what country keeps you company? And what time do your curtains memorize? Should this wandering through bells and turnip lamps ease your breath, you're welcome to subscribe to the entire history, so that on other dusky evenings, the paths of old villages and sea-salted songs will find your window without knocking. The mummers, having licked spice from their fingers, with the solemn care of altar boys, rose and bowed, promising to carry the abbey's blessing to the cottages where the old and the ill sat close to the fire. Their lantern grinned its hopeful grin as they stepped into the courtyard, where moonlight had made a pale coin on the well's lip and left it there, unspent. The gate swung with a sound, like a book turning a page, and the brothers followed them out to the threshold. Beyond, the green was gathering its small theatre, linen faces and clumsy antlers, a fool's cap that had belonged to 3 fools before this one, and laughter carried like seed on the dark, which even the ancestors, if they paid attention, might have recognized as courage wearing its comic mask. And at the far edge of the lane, where the hedges drew a careful seam between field and path, something paused, perhaps a dog, perhaps the night practicing a shape, and for a breath's length no one decided which it was. They only watched, and the watching made of the pause a little shrine where fear and wonder set their offerings side by side, waiting for the wind to choose a direction. They walked to the edge of the moor as planned, not in a procession but in that easy, thoughtful line people make when no one is hurrying and the road is known by heart. The gate there was iron and yew root together, a marriage of work and wilderness. It clicked softly when the wind found it, like knitting needles counting rows in a lap. Mist drew itself up from the peat and unrolled over the grass in gentle ribbons so thin you could almost hear them, and the lamps the brothers carried behaved like patient stars, relocated to hand height, moving when they moved, pausing when they paused. The village lay behind them, with its small dramas, laughter on the green, a kettle singing, a child arguing, then sleeping, then dreaming, and before them the moor opened like a slow book, each page a shadowed fold, each fold a place where the world kept a quieter language. The steward of the watch lifted a hand, and the talking grew softer still. They listened to the way moisture makes the air seem thick with memory, to the owl's clean question and the reed's thin answer, to the slosh of a hidden ditch, as if the earth were drinking modestly from its own cup. There had been tales, of course, always there were tales, of lights wandering where no house stood, of a rider whose horse left no hoofprint, of a black hound that walked ahead of travellers, not to frighten them, but to show the safer ground. And though scholars who prefer catalogues to midnights might smile at such talk, even they would have hushed at this hour, for the moor asked listening first and explanation after. The prior spoke, not to command, but to notice aloud what they all felt, that this eve drew a thread through the valley's fabric, binding hearth to hedgerow, altar to orchard, names in the ledger to breath, steaming in the lantern light. The thread was not stringently woven, but elastic, kind, so that even the clumsiest heart could be held without tearing. He took from his sleeve a small parchment and read a few lines composed for this vigil, new words wearing old shoes, about mercy, walking with the hungry and the lost, and about doors that learn to open as they age. And as he read, the mist behaved like a congregation, gathering, bowing, parting, returning. A lay brother set a little loaf on the gatepost, nothing formal, just bread and a pinch of salt, and said the old words for wandering souls and the newer ones for neighbours who might be late coming home. The gesture was so ordinary, it felt like truth. Beyond the wall, the green answered with a far-off cheer. The mummers had started their play, foolish and brave, saints and wildlings, and a physician with an absurdly long spoon, curing even the moon of her pale complexion. The sound came along the hedges like dandelion seed, and settled on the moor's lip without disturbance. A novice, emboldened by the night's gentleness, asked the question children always carry, like a bright coin, whether the dead were happy to be called by name, whether it tugged at them like a thread on a sleeve. The prior considered, then said that love is a door on both sides, and the hand that touches it is never unwelcome. The boy nodded, and his lamp, delighted by agreement, made a little circle on the path like a seal. They turned back slowly, for no one wished to break the spell quickly. And as they walked, the librarian told of a page he had mended that afternoon, a saint's life whose margin bore, in a thumbprint of long vanished ink, the shape of a leaf. He spoke as if the leaf had continued growing inside the book, sending a root into every story that asked for kindness. At the fence, where the lane narrowed, they met the miller's wife carrying a basket covered with clean linen. She was taking spice cakes to a widow whose laughter had gone thin since spring. The brothers lifted their lamps in greeting, small Hallows on ordinary errands. The bell, far behind them, laid a slow woolen sound across the roofs, calling for the last prayers before the hour turned, and it occurred to them, sharp, sweet, that clocks are only one way of knowing time, and that tonight time was also counted by the distance a blessing could travel before its warmth cooled, by the breaths between candle and window, by the moment a door unlatches without fear. If you were there with us in this hour, wherever your night is flowering, what country keeps your window, and what time do your curtains hold like a soft secret? If this quiet path through mist and memory is a comfort, You are gently invited to subscribe to the entire history, so that these slow, lantern-lit walks from harvest to winter may find you again, on evenings when sleep is a friend hovering just beyond the hedges. Near the churchyard, the yew gave its resin breath and seemed taller, as if centuries were a simple garment it could shrug on or off. Beneath it, the ledger waited with its names, not solemn like stone, but companionable like worn wool. People who had taught geese to follow a sprinkled line of feed, who had stitched leather with a bone needle smooth as river glass, who had carved a joke into a seat where only the careful would find it. The brothers filed into the nave, letting the door rest against its frame as gently as a hand laid over a child's eyes at bedtime. Their song rose like steam, visible only if one loved it, and drifted up to the beams where smoke had already written its soft annotations. Outside, the green was still bright with foolishness and cider, with clapping and stamping and those old, agreeable fears that leave laughter where they pass. And beyond that brightness, the moor breathed, in its great, quiet way, keeping safe the footfalls of riders who never were, and dogs who were sometimes only fog, and perhaps sometimes not. And just as the last note of Compline leaned into silence, a tremor like a thread drawn carefully through cloth moved along the village. Doors lifted on their latches, one after another, by no hand anyone could name, only by the season itself perhaps, and in every doorway a small flame swam up, blinking awake as if windows had remembered how to be eyes. By the time the bell's woolen note had folded itself back into the tower stones, the village was moving in its smallest rituals, the sort that wear slippers so the night won't wake. In kitchens where the fire kept a low red eye, hands dusted flour from bread just drawn from the oven, round loaves pricked with a cross and set on the sill with a pinch of salt, as if thresholds themselves had mouths that needed feeding. In one cottage near the brook, timbers dark as tea, roof thatched as carefully as a thought, the old widow, who had lost her laughter in spring, placed 3 soul cakes on a plate and added the sliver of an apple, remembering the orchard she and her husband had grafted with more hope than skill. She listened because she had promised to listen, and when the 3 knocks came, soft as a robin's idea of thunder, she answered with a smile that found its way back to her face, like a stray cat to its bowl. The children on the step sang their thin blessing, linen masks lifting with each breath, and she pressed a coin into one small hand and a prayer into the air between them. The cakes, streaked faintly with nutmeg, went into the basket, and the boys left a rosemary sprig tucked in her latch as if to teach the door a green word. Across the lane, a man said his father's name beside his mother's in a ledger of his own. Only a folded scrap kept in the drawer with twine and spare buttons, and spoke those names aloud in the voice he used for reading recipes, careful and practical. Scholars might someday argue whether the practice had reached this valley from distant rites, or grown like a fern from damp stone here, but the argument would seem to him as remote as a hawk's flight, for the names were close as steam. A little farther on, under the crooked sign of the mill, the lay brother returned to his night rounds and paused when the mist drafted across the lane like a curtain considering its part. There, for a blink, he thought he saw the black hound of tale and comfort, tail tapping the earth in a rhythm older than fear. It was easy on such a night to let the mind hold 2 cups at once, the cup of folklore and the cup of faith, and to find that both held the same warm drink, only seasoned differently. The prior, who had walked out again to be sure every candle found its window, would have said so if asked, and he would have added that kindness is the spice that makes all cups neighbourly. In the abbey a reliquary gleamed, like a small harvest moon, silver chased with leaves, and the faintest suggestion of wings. And the bone within it, whether apostle or unknown holy labourer, cast a shadow that seemed to lean toward the poor box, the way an elder leans toward a child. Some swore fevers cooled when that shadow fell across a brow. Others said gossip warmed when it fell across a market bench, and perhaps both were true, for miracles often keep two pockets like a travelling tinker, and draw from the right or the left, depending on who asks. A page lay open beside the relic, a psalm whose letters looked as if they had been written by candlelight, that yawned and blinked, and the monk tracing the lines felt the old language move under his finger like a stream under ice. Speaking even when it seemed still, he thought of the novice's question about tugging the dead by their names, and returned quietly, like an oar returning to a boat, to the prior's answer that love is a door with two handles and no lock. Out on the green the mummers bowed to laughter, and their play, simple as bread and just as beloved, ended with the physician waving that ridiculous spoon as if to ladle courage into everyone's pockets. The fiddler's tune, finally found, stepped off the stage and walked arm in arm with the crowd as they dispersed. A melody that would reappear later, at hearths in the tapping of feet and the humming of lids on simmering pots. The steward of the watch took his rounds with an ease that looked like bravery and felt like habit. He nodded to the hedges, which answered in chilly syllables, and to the pond where the moon laid down a second trembling self. At the far bend he paused by the cottage of a man known for mending saddles and silences, and noticed a candle steady in the window, as if guarding a secret that was not dark at all but tender. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a memory being carefully folded. And if you are awake with them now, miles away beneath another sky, what country keeps you company, and what time is speaking from your clock? If this slow weaving of bells and bread, of reliquary glimmer and turnip grin has gentled your evening, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history, so that the hush of old villages and the kindly courage of their customs can find you again when night leans close. Near midnight, the wind changed its mind and came from the orchards, bringing with it a sweetness that had learned Frost's grammar. Somewhere a fox stitched the field to the wood with light steps, and somewhere a shudder tapped once, as if remembering a story it hoped would be told. The abbey door, on its good hinges, breathed in and breathed out, and the yew, with its ink-smelling needles, held the night like a ledger with infinite pages. The monk closed the book, not to end the names, but to keep them warmer, and the prior, standing alone for a moment in the nave, lifted his hand as if blessing all the rooms where a single flame kept company with sleep. In the cottage by the brook, the widow lay down, and before the edge of rest, felt, quite without alarm, quite without proof, the soft indifference of grief turning toward a gentler season, like a river deciding in thaw to remember its own song. And across the green, a child who had asked earlier whether wind could carry a name, dreamed of letters floating like dandelion seeds above the moor, and settling, one by one, at good doors. The village slept then, not as if it had shut the book, but as if it had left a ribbon between the pages. Mist gathered its hems and went walking. The owl counted its coins and spent none. And over the well a round of moonlight rested, unspent still, a small bright promise waiting for whatever the next hour might quietly bring. Toward the hour when even the owls grow economical with their calls, the brothers crossed the little court where the well kept a coign of moonlight and turned toward the charnel house, that low stone neighbour of the nave, whose doorway wore a lintel smoothed by centuries of careful grief. There the past was arranged with tidy mercy, skulls in even rows, femurs stacked like firewood for a winter of remembering, the air cool as folded linen. It was not horror, but humility that lived there, a lesson spoken in bone that everyone attends the same school of dust. A single lamp hung from an iron hook, steady as a vow, and beside it a painted board, older than the youngest moss, younger than the yew, showed that grave ring of figures which some called the danse macabre, kings and carters, abbots and laundresses, children and greybeards, all hand in hand, with death rendered, not as a scream, but as a host who insists every guest take a turn. Scholars visiting in later ages would lean close, counting the brush strokes and the Latin knotted in the corners, arguing, kindly or not, whether such scenes were born from plague years alone or from a deeper medieval appetite for levelling truths, whether the dance taught submission or companionship. Here, though, the brothers saw only invitation, the way one sees the sea and thinks not of drowning, but of the taste of salt. The sacrist set down the ledger with its thick, tender names and traced a small cross in the dust upon the table. He spoke of a woman whose dowry had been a pull of blue thread and a good needle, of a miller who once lent his best sack to a stranger and never asked it back, of a child who kept pebbles in his pocket and believed they were saints in travel-sized clothes. In the corner a reliquary gleamed, modest and sure, silver-leafed with vine and bird. Within it a bone whose certainty no one could prove, and no one tonight wished to. Some said it was a shard from a missionary who crossed the cold sea for love of names he had not yet heard. Others said it belonged to an anonymous holy labourer who set stones so square they taught walls to stand. Either way, its shadow fell long across the poor box, and in that shadow copper coins looked like little sons choosing humility. A brother spoke, almost apologetically, of indulgences once sold too eagerly in markets where every need has a price, and of the stern, necessary arguments that followed. The prior nodded, saying softly that the heart remembers not the ledgers of sin but the candles of mercy, and that the best theology is the kind that sits at a table and shares bread without asking for a receipt. Outside, fog worked at the windows as if trying a soft eraser over the glass. Inside, the lamp gave the skulls a patient glow, as if each forehead had learned to wear moonrise. A novice, who had never quite decided whether courage was a root or a wing, asked if praying among bones gave offence to the dead. The librarian replied that if love is truly a door with two handles, then this room is only a hallway, and hallways are for passing through together. They sang one psalm in a key the bones seemed to know. The sound did not travel far, but it travelled deep, finding those small hollows in the heart where regret is stored, and pouring gentleness there, like warm water into an aching hand. When the last note thinned to thread, the prior lifted the lamp and beckoned them onward, and they stepped out beneath the yew, where the needles made their dark, ink-scented hush. He spoke of All Hallows and All Souls as neighbouring fields divided by a low stone wall, easy to cross with a short stride of charity, and of how this season had always braided harvest gratitude with winter's frankness. On the green, The mummer's foolishness had settled into storytelling around a low fire. An old soldier described the moon as a shield dented by many wars. A girl said it was a slice from a shepherd's cheese. Somewhere a fiddler, now confident, had traded speed for tenderness and found that tenderness kept better time. The watchman came to the abbey gate with a report as polite as a bow. No rider on the lane, but the sound of hooves, heard once and then converted into silence. No black hound, only a patch of fog that consented to the shape of a dog and followed him for 20 paces before choosing to be only fog again. No mischief but the wind, which had learned a new syllable near the orchard and was eager to pronounce it at shutters. The prior thanked him and gave him a scrap of spiced cake that tasted like the library smells: nutmeg, ash, old wood, patience. They spoke for a while of origins, how customs travel like seeds under hems and in the fur of animals, how a song sung in a byre might wear the cloak of a hymn and no one is the poorer. A visiting canon years back had insisted that souling was a misplaced relic of older rites, while the Glover's mother thought it simply the valley's way of keeping company with those who are hard to carry in daylight. The brothers agreed that the important part is the carrying. The lamp, feeling its oil's end approach, lowered its brightness to kindness. They took that hint and moved toward the nave, each candle cupped like a small, bright animal that trusted their hands. In a side chapel, the fresco of St. Michael had lost half an eye to damp, and yet kept the smile of a patient sword. Beneath it, a basket waited for letters that would be read tomorrow, little folded fields, where requests and thank yous grew side by side. A child's hand had scrawled, large and earnest, "Please keep our cow from coughing." And next to it, in script, small as a sparrow's foot, someone had written, "I forgive him," with no name, which is sometimes the braver way. The bell gave one woolen breath, then another, marking not the division of time but its stitching, and the village listened without needing to count. In the widow's cottage by the brook, sleep gathered itself like a quilt. At the mill, flour dust lay on the bench in a soft version of snow, and at the farthest hedge a fox turned its head to regard the abbey light as if considering conversion, then trotted on with the serene refusal of wild things. Inside the brothers, the novice, the watchman, with his useful steadiness, and the librarian who learned leaves in margins, stood a long moment in that middle place where silence has not yet decided to be sleep. They did not command the hour, they accompanied it. And while they stood, a faint, wandering glow winked to life at the river's bend. Neither star nor torch, neither trick nor certain truth, only a light that seemed to remember a name and to be on its way somewhere gentle, following the water as if the current had written a quiet invitation down the valley toward a door that might lift its latch of its own accord. The glow at the river's bend did not hurry. It unstitched itself from the bank with the patience of someone leaving quietly so as not to wake a room, and drifted along the current where reeds made cursive notes in the dark. The watchman, who had long practice at walking beside things he could not name, lifted his lamp and matched its pace from the path, keeping a respectful hedge between himself and the water. Behind him came the librarian with his good boots, the novice with his nervous courage, and at a remove, the prior, whose steps always sounded like a blessing looking for a place to land. They all knew the old marsh talk about lights that led the greedy into holes and the humble safely home, tales travellers called will-o'-the-wisp, and which scholars, when the ink was warm and the day obedient, attributed to gases dreaming themselves into flame above wet ground. But on nights like this, both explanations put their arms around each other and walked in the same direction, and no one pressed them to part. The lamp in the watchman's hand threw a shallow road across the water, a trembling bridge no foot could cross, and on that road the wandering glow seemed for a breath to pause, as if reading a sign. It slipped forward again, slow as a psalm, past the alder whose roots tasted the river and the ash stump that had once held a beehive. It passed the ford where carts nudged their courage from one bank to the other, then turned, a decision almost theatrical in its gentleness, toward the meadow that led up to the widow's cottage by the brook. The novice drew in his breath, for some hopes are named before they're dared, that a light might visit where grief had been sitting too long with its shoes on, that a small, inexplicable kindness could nudge a season's hinge. They climbed the meadow's slope, each lantern respecting the other's circle, and the prior made a tiny sign of the cross, not to master the moment, but to greet it. The cottage, when they reached it, appeared as it always did, timbers calm, the windows squared like a sensible face. The little doorway with its latch remembering many hands, and yet it felt companioned, as if the air had developed a listening posture. Inside, a candle had been left to keep company with the night, and on the sill the 3 soul cakes waited like little moons at different phases. The glow halted at the lintel and thinned until it seemed no more than the suggestion of a moth. Then, with a courtesy older than custom, it settled against the window as if to warm the glass. After a time that could be measured by the bell's woolen heart, 2, then 3 slow breaths from the tower. The light loosened itself like a ribbon released and drifted on, following the brook's murmuring grammar back toward the river, unspooling its small brightness without waste. A mercy without a message, the librarian whispered, pleased. The prior answered that sometimes mercy is the message, and the novice, hearing it, stored the sentence like a seed he meant to pocket for spring. They followed the water downstream, and as they went, the land practiced its delicate theatre, a fox leaving commas in the mud, a heron unfolding like a letter meant for one reader, a sudden fragrance of apples where no tree stood, as if the orchard had breathed out a memory, and the mist had carried it here to admire. By the old plank bridge they paused. For the river there kept an eddy that liked to tell stories to itself. The prior leaned on the rail and spoke of pilgrims he had known years before, men and women moving through weather with scallop shells at their hats and blisters like fresh coins at their heels, and of how some returned with relics, and some with recipes, and some with nothing but the polished humility of roads walked. Scholars in calmer seasons might sort such reliquaries by provenance and writing, the honest work of minds making maps, but the prior said very quietly that this valley's truest relic was its habit of putting a light in the window whenever a name needed company. The watchman, practical as bread, pointed where the glow had gone, and they set off again until the yew's dark spire showed above the churchyard, the tree-drinking moonlight, the way a pen drinks ink. In the charnel house the lamp had gone low, but not unkind. Bones shone with that patient shine which comes of waiting without complaint, and the painted dance on the board looked younger by some trick of shadow, as if Death himself had become a more generous host while they were away. The sacrist, who had not left, sat with the ledger open and a cup of ale standing guard. He had added 2 names in their absence, one the foreign tinker who had smiled at every gate, One, a girl from the far farm whose laughter had become a distant bell since summer, and next to each he had marked a tiny star, not to say certainty, but to remember light. They kept silence there, a silence lively as a pond, where small things move beneath the skin of water, and when they stepped out again, the east had discovered the faintest whitening, the first rehearsal of morning behind a curtain. It would be too much to say the village had changed in the hours between bells. Roofs still kept their thatch. The pond still kept a second trembling moon. The green still learned its foolishness by heart. Yet something in the seams felt newly mended, as if the cloth of the place had been turned and a fresh side laid against the skin. The widow's window showed its candle still. The mill's sign barely creaked. The hedges held 100 cooled whispers, and the moor, faithful moor, breathed its long, level breath as though tuning itself to daylight. They made for the nave for final prayers, and the novice, walking last with a care he did not wish to look like fear, noticed along the lane 3 rosemary sprigs tucked at 3 doors, gifts from small masked voices, each fragrant note a reminder that sometimes doors are the bravest part of a house. Inside, the nave accepted them the way a field accepts rain, with no demand but use. Wax scented the air with its warm, bee-spun grammar, and the fresco of St. Michael, missing half an eye and none of his patience, regarded them as equals in the old work of keeping hearts lifted without forcing wings. The bells would speak again soon, not to end the vigil, but to fold it, as one folds a letter one means to read again. For now they stood and breathed in time with the candles, and if any one of them thought of the river's light, he did not clutch at the thought but let it pass, like a blessing moving through a room, touching shoulders with an affectionate brush, making no promises beyond the one it had already kept, that this night too belonged to kindness. And while they stood, a pale seam grew along the hills. The mist loosened its hems. A cock sang once, as if remembering his lines, and far off, along the water, that small obedient glow rehearsed its vanishing, thinner, thinner, until it could hardly be said to be anything at all, except perhaps a name, remembering itself in the mouth of dawn. Morning, when it finally chose to arrive, did so with courtesy. First a seam of pale linen at the hilltop, then a softening of the hedges, then the quiet revision of colour in every thatch and stone. The bell, whose voice had been woolen through the night, found a fresher thread and let it slip once across the roofs. Shutters lifted like eyelids that trusted the day, and smoke, modest and convinced, rehearsed its small sermons from cottage chimneys. In the abbey yard, the Jew made a rosary along every blade, and the yew, patient archivist that it was, stood newly inked against the whitening sky. Beneath it, the brothers, red-eyed but uncomplaining, breathed the early air as if tasting a page before reading it aloud. Matins gave way to lauds, and lauds to the practical sacraments of bread and sweeping. The novice who had carried his courage like a lamp all night now carried a broom and discovered that holiness too likes the sound of straw against stone. Along the green, traces of the mummer's foolishness lingered kindly. 2 chalk stars on a doorstep, a paper crown bewitched by dew, a turnip lantern gone contemplative and slumping toward the earth, and at the far fence a gate stood improbably where a gate had not stood yesterday, some midnight strongbacks having reversed the mischief of a former year, as if to balance the books of the village with a jest in tidy handwriting. The watchman finished his round at the brook and reported to no one in particular that the night had been generous with its quiet. He said this to the water, which agreed, by continuing to go where it went. In the nave, All Saints' Day blossomed the way old rituals do, without surprise, and yet with that faint, dear astonishment that there is still breath enough to sing, and the singing came, not like a trumpet, but like bread breaking, shared in pieces, warming fingers. Names were not read now. This day leaned toward the known multitude rather than the particular. Even so, the ledger's weight was felt behind the altar like a friendly hand at one's back. A pilgrim from the north, his cloak salted with road dust, whispered afterward to the prior that in his country, too, there were fires at Harvest's Edge and bread handed to doorways, and children who liked a fright so mild it behaved. Whether one custom had borrowed the other's cloak, or both had been kin before they learned their letters, he could not say. Scholars would still argue in calmer rooms about such things, smoothing their papers and drawing arrows between centuries, but the prior only smiled and said that love recognizes its relatives at a glance. In the cottage by the brook, the widow woke to a gentler gravity in her chest. She rose slowly, the way a word rises toward the lips after long reluctance, and found the rosemary at her latch, green as a kept promise. She steeped a sprig in hot water, as if translating plant into kindness, and when she drank it, the steam climbed past her face like a blessing. On the road, 2 boys in yesterday's masks, linen now damp and honest, kicked leaf piles into brief gold storms. They discussed whether pumpkins, which had only lately become fashionable in drawings and travellers' tales, were worth carving if good turnips could still be got. A farmer passing with a barrow of beets contributed that pumpkins were showy and turnips more companionable, but that both would smile if you asked them kindly. In the refectory, the librarian read a scrap he had copied from a saint's life about the difference between spectacle and festival, how one travels without roots, and the other grows where it is planted. The brothers ate oatcakes and nodded, not because the thought was new, but because it wore the right shoes for this floor. After prime, a few villagers gathered near the charnel house to tidy the little garden where Rue and Tansy kept their watch. A mason pointed to the painted dance on the panel and said that years ago a travelling canon from the city had called it indecorous, and a carpenter's wife had replied that the panel had taught her to treat her neighbours as equals and her enemies as temporary. No one remembered the canon's name now, but everyone remembered the wife with fondness, and so the panel remained patient as weather, wearing whatever teaching the century asked of it. By late morning, carts creaked from field to market with such modest pride as dried apples, last onions, and uneven skeins of yarn could provide. A fiddler tried his recovered tune against the day and discovered that daylight prefers a slower bow. The tune obliged and became a walk rather than a run. A small debate, tender as laundry, warmed the edge of the green. Whether the vigil had grown quieter than it used to be, whether boys were less inclined to carry gates or more inclined to carry lanterns, whether saints liked their flowers in bunches or in pots they could keep. Answers were fewer than opinions, but the talk itself was a kind of weaving, and by noon the village wore it comfortably. The monk with the ledger took his seat by the church door with a basin where coins could clink or not, and nearby set a second bowl where notes could rest, thanks that did not fit in words, names that needed more warmth, small drawings of loaves and stars by children excavating the limits of their ink. He read each mark as if it were a syllable of the same long poem. When a girl brought him a single feather, black with a green river in it, he placed it between the pages as a bookmark for mercy. Clouds came and went, unhurried, like sorts remembered just in time. A hawk wrote a brief, decisive sentence across the sky. The mill turned, the pond lifted and lowered its silent shoulder. And somewhere along the river's bend, where the wandering glow had rehearsed its vanishing, a scrap of brightness clung to a reed, then dissolved, unspectacularly, like sugar agreeing while it disappeared. Afternoon would bring the common table, soup with stones for luck removed before serving, bread with its familiar cross, a small wedge of cheese that understood the difference between feast and plain kindness, and afterward a slow hour when even industrious hands consented to stillness. The prior walked the lane one more time before returning to his reading. He paused at 3 doors where rosemary had been tucked, and at one where a child had left a clumsy paper moon. He paused longest by the widows, not to intrude, only to share the air that was learning to be lighter. And then he lifted his eyes to the yew, which lifted its needles toward a sky that had at last decided on blue. The tree seemed to say in its resin breath that keeping is not the only form of memory, that letting the night loosen its grip is also a way of honouring it. Evening would come as it must, and another bell with it. But for now the village inhabited the between. Harvest counted, winter admitted, the ledger closed but warm in the hand, and beyond all that, at the low edge of sight, the moor lay content, sewing the horizon with its long, level thread, while in a window near the brook a cup gave back a thin curl of steam that rose and rose, and did not yet choose where to become cloud. Afternoon laid a gentle palm across the village, and what had been the bright hush of morning softened into that companionable quiet in which work and rest take turns without quarrelling. The common table was set in the green's mild sun, benches pulled close as if for warmth, though the day asked for none. Cauldrons gave up their steam in measured breath, and bowls travelled from hand to hand like small boats, ferrying comfort from one shore of appetite to the other. Bread cross-marked and modest appeared in slices even as patience. A cheese that had matured alongside the abbey wall offered itself with the gravity of old stone. There was soup tasting faintly of herbs, and long listening, and cider that remembered the orchard as clearly as a letter remembers its writer. People ate with the slow gratitude that comes when hunger is not a stranger, but no longer in the room. Names surfaced in conversation like fish breaking a pond, brief, glistening, then slid back under, the talk itself a net that kept nothing captive and lost nothing wholly. The prior moved among them without hurry, receiving the small courtesies that farmers extend to men who bless their seasons, returning each with the equal courtesy of a gardener who knows where bees prefer to land. Now and then he paused to let a story finish brewing, for stories, like tea, are unkind when rushed. At the far bench the mason and the weaver good-naturedly resumed an old debate about the painted dance in the charnel house, whether its oldest layer had been laid down in the plague year, or whether the underdrawing belonged to a wandering craftsman from across the sea. The librarian, invited, but refusing to adjudicate, only smiled and suggested they both were right in the way 2 hands are right when they clap. A child listened, eyes round as saucers, and asked if the skeletons minded their partners. They mind less than we do, the weaver said, and the child, pleased, committed the line to memory, the way one pockets a smooth stone. Nearby, The widow from the brook sat with a cup of rosemary tea and found that company returned to her like sunlight returns to a room the builder thought too small for it. She did not speak of the night's faint visiting light. Some mercies, wish for the privacy of a closed palm, but her shoulders wore less weight, and even her quiet seemed warmed from within. A cart arrived late, with apples that carried a bite of frost and a sweetness which did not apologize for it. Two boys, not the mummers, but their cousins, rolled barrels with the solemnity of priests moving reliquaries, and their earnest caution made the watching adults smile in their sleeves. On the church steps, the monk with the ledger offered a bowl of blank slips and a stub of good ink, inviting anyone to add what the morning had failed to say. Notes in different hands appeared: for a sister on the road, for the geese to fly easy, a picture of a loaf with steam drawn like music, a clumsy star, and the monk tucked each into the ledger's mouth as if feeding a tame, paper-eating creature. The watchman between rounds described the river at dawn as having worn a scarf of mist with more elegance than any alderman's wife. He said it without poetry on purpose, and so the sentence fit the day like a well-used glove. From the north path a pilgrim lingered, showing the prior a scallop shell as flat as a held breath. He spoke of other valleys where turnips and pumpkins had swapped places in windows, where saints' days and harvest rites braided their calendars until dates behaved like cousins who share clothes. Scholars, he admitted with a rueful grin, still argued in proper buildings whether such braiding was thievery or kinship, but to his boots the roads felt friendly either way. The prior answered that roads become neighbours when we walk them kindly, and the pilgrim, content, traded the shell for a slice of bread and tucked the exchange into the travelling sack, where he kept a thread, a needle, 3 good nails, and a little salt for making other places taste like home. The bell gave a single velvety breath to remind the afternoon that time, like soup, benefits from simmering. Shadows took the hint and lengthened lazily along the green, knitting the feet of benches to the earth. A flock of starlings rehearsed some future choreography above the fields, practicing the soft arithmetic that will let them turn together without meeting. Beneath them the moor dreamed its slow dreams, keeping the village stitched to the horizon with a thread no storm could quite unpick. In the nave, a lay sister polished the brass with strokes as consistent as a psalm's refrain. She did not shorten her work because the day had been long, nor lengthen it because the church would gleam for praise, but found the middle way, where good labour rests while still occurring. The fresco of St. Michael, still missing half an eye and none of his mercy, breathed a little brighter in the slant light. In the side chapel, the basket of letters had grown heavy with folded certainties and whispered maybes, and a prayer asking for a cow's cough to be gentle had been joined by one asking for a sun's temper to forget itself. Toward the hedgerow, where paths leave the green like sentences finding their periods, the mummers laid their linen masks to dry over a fence and discovered that, stripped of faces, they were merely boys again, knees muddy, hands busy, kindness available. They argued cheerfully about the relative virtues of turnip grins versus pumpkin grins, and agreed, finally, that a grin's value lies in the welcome it invites. A breeze, after consulting with the ewe, decided to make a small tour of the village. It lifted flour dust from the mill sill as if turning pages, ruffled the ledger's ribbon with the gentlest of admonitions, and teased the pond into offering 2 or 3 extra moons purely for mischief. Somewhere in the orchard a ladder leaned against nothing. Harvest done, Purpose remembered out of habit, and the latter, enjoying its idleness, made a quiet vow to be useful again when the season called its name. The prior looked once more down the lane to the widow's door, but from this distance saw only the domestic poetry of a kettle's steam written on air. He allowed himself the simple hope that the night, when it returned, would find the village in the same tender alignment, names warmed, doors companionable, candles remembering how to teach the dark its manners. And as the sun walked nearer the hedges, laying its last gold carefully where shadows would soon be asked to keep house, a single rook crossed above the yew, black upon brightness, wing beats measured like a heartbeat trying not to disturb a sleeping room. Then it was gone, leaving only the slight quiver of air where it had been, and in that quiver the village paused, as if listening for a footfall that had not yet decided whether to belong to evening or to something older that sometimes uses evening as its polite disguise. Evening gathered with the tact of an old friend who knows where every chair belongs and never moves them. Light thinned to honey along the hedges, and the roofs put on their dusk like shawls pulled closer at the shoulders. The bell, courteous as always, gave a soft summons for vespers that threaded the green, touched the orchard with a fingertip of sound, and went on to stroke the pond until the water kept its own small echo. People answered without haste, men brushing flour from sleeves, women setting lids on pots to keep the supper's heat patient, children pocketing pebbles and returning borrowed sticks to the feet of hedges, so that the village itself seemed to rise discreetly and go walking toward the nave. Inside, lamps opened like measured blossoms, smoke lifted in pale braids to right the beams with another lesson in gentleness, and the fresco of St. Michael, half-eyed and wholehearted, received the dim with the same steady smile it gave to noon. The psalms moved at the speed of breathing, and in the same key, a work song for what hearts know but cannot carry by themselves. It was not a many-voiced performance, but an agreement, as if each tongue became a stitch, and the evening grateful put on its mendings. Between verses, threads of thought continued the debates that daylight had worn like a comfortable coat, whether the painted dancer's first patient bones belonged to a plague century or to a craftsman's travelling fancy, whether lantern faces ought to be cut from the good, dense turnips that hold a line like a vow, or from the new, foreign pumpkins whose orange theatre tempts the knife into generosity. The librarian, who loved a footnote more than bread, but needed bread to read a footnote, let the questions sit beside him like friendly dogs. He had found earlier in an old sermon a sentence that pleased him. A festival is a field sown with consent, and he kept turning it as one turns a coin to feel its edges. The prior, for his part, did not try to tame the village into one answer. He once said that custom is a river that remembers every stone it has passed, and if sometimes it loops, who are we to tell it which bend is truer? And though the sentence sounded like a proverb, he had meant it only as hospitality. When the last psalm thinned to a gentle thread and tied the hour to itself, the brothers stood for a time in the nave's quiet afterglow. Outside, the air had prepared the first crispness that lets breath show its own lantern shape, and the lane to the yew understood the boots of those who walked it. Under that tree, the patient archivist, the ground was already telling the night what it had learned. Footsteps as commas, a dragged pole as an exclamation, a child's hop as a punctuation mark, no grammar yet, acknowledges. The watchman reported, half amused, that the green had been free of mischief, except for the pond offering 6 unnecessary moons. The steward of the mill said he'd found a ladder leaning against Purpose again, and had thanked it for its service. The widow, invited by silence rather than by words, took a place on the bench and felt the company of names the way one feels sunlight on one's sleeve, unobtrusive, certain. A wind from the orchard came, with a pocket full of smell, apples that had met frost and not apologised for it, leaves rehearsing their loosening, the faint iron taste of tools resting from their season, and then, having given, went on to find which shutter wished to speak of weather. A traveller from the west, coat carrying the taste of salt air, stood shyly at the edge and volunteered a story told in another valley, of doors left on the latch and bowls of milk set out, of children in linen masks whose songs changed only the way rivers change, by remembering, of a monk who wrote a ledger, not of sins but of kindness, and of how, across years, people argued cheerfully over who had borrowed the other's lantern first. The weaver answered that arguments, when they are polite and fed, make good winter companions, and the mason agreed by passing him a crust. Somewhere on the moor a rook stitched the last seam between colour and night. Somewhere on the road a cart made that soothing arithmetic of wheel and stone that assures a place it is known. And from the charnel house, steady as a heartbeat, the little lamp kept vigil among the evening's patient teachers of equality. In the side chapel, the basket of letters had grown heavier. A brother lifted one at random and read, not to the room, but to his own ribs, for laughter that returns without knocking, and he tucked it back as if returning a bird to a pocket where warmth waits. The prior walked the aisle with the attentiveness of a gardener picking slugs from lettuces, noticing where wax needed scraping, where a draught thought too well of itself, where a child's drawing of a loaf on the notice board had earned a star in pencil from some silent admirer. He paused by the ledger, and without opening it, laid his hand on the cover the way one consoles a creature that has done its work. The book answered by being merely warm. Beyond the churchyard, the green was shedding its brightness like a garment. The mummers' masks, now crisp with evening, were gathered from the fence and stacked like commas waiting for another sentence next year. The librarian told the novice, who had been courageous in all the quiet ways, about a note he once found between pages, two circles touching, dark and light, with the whisper beneath, "Where they meet, mercy grows." The novice, storing it as one stores flint, asked whether that meeting was what tonight had been. The librarian said perhaps, and perhaps again tomorrow, in smaller scripts, at the brook, at the door, at the well, where moonlight likes to rest. Supper was simple, soup finishing its old, gentle sermon, bread spreading its grainy manners, a wedge of cheese that remembered the cow by name, and ale that had matured into patience. The talk was softer than earlier, like the low chuckle of a kettle when it knows it will not boil over. Even the village dog, if such a creature could be accused of ownership by anyone, slept with one ear turned outward in case a knock wished for a witness. After the bowls were cleared and the last pot had found its place on the hook, they stepped out again because evening, once started, requests accompaniment. The lane lay pliant as a ribbon, and each lamp cupped in hands drew a small circle you could stand inside and call horizon. Up at the river's bend, where dawn had once rehearsed a vanishing, a pale uncertainty loosened from the reeds. It might have been mist practicing memory. It might have been a light, remembering its manners. It might have been nothing at all, except that everyone felt the air grow kinder, and the hedges leaned as if to hear better. No one named it. Names, like nets, sometimes take too much. They walked home by ones and twos, and the village, grateful for its own breath, allowed the dark to enter as a guest who knows the family, sensible, curious, a little proud of its stories, doors set to their latches, with sounds that always remember hands, windows kept their modest eyes, and under the yew, needles gathered the last rumour of footsteps and said nothing. Far along the hedgerow, a single doorway remained ajar, not carelessly but like a pulse, steady, welcoming, and on its sill a candle leaned its flame toward the night as if listening for a voice that had not yet decided to speak. Night came down without argument, the way a familiar quilt settles over a dozing lap, and the village learned again the old grammar of lantern and hush. The single doorway, left ajar, kept its patient glow, a pulse you could have timed the heart to. And along the hedgerows, the last crumbs of talk were gathered up by the wind and tucked into the dark, like bread saved for morning birds. The watchman began his rounds with a lamp steady as a vow. He had the useful gift of walking softly, without appearing to sneak, as though the street itself approved of his tread. Behind shutters, utensils slept in their drawers, and the day's work folded itself into order. A kettle, not yet willing to forget its warmth, hummed without sound, and a broom leaned with the posture of a pilgrim accepting rest. Beneath the yew, resin breathed like ink musing on what it had recorded. Beyond the churchyard wall, the pond wore a second tremulous moon that refused to agree to stillness, and over the moor a mild draught trailed its sleeve along the grass to feel how late the dew had become. The prior came last into the nave to check the doors, not from suspicion, but from tenderness. He paused by the basket in the side chapel where folded papers slept like doves, requests that had learned to be small in order to fly, and touching the pile with 2 fingers, he let a wordless blessing slip from thought into air, the way a seed leaves a hand and begins its braver work. In the charnel house, the lamp kept its small theology, every face a face, even when the flesh is done with it, every brow a brow, even when time has rubbed it smooth. The painted dance on the panel looked, by some trick of shadow, less like a warning and more like a choir practice where the living rehearse how to keep time with the dead. A mouse, justified by winter's early rumours, inspected a fallen crumb and, finding it generous, treated the stone threshold like a table. The watchman saw and smiled, for even vigilance permits small mercies to pass. Down by the river bend, reeds wrote cursive into the dark, and something alight perhaps, or only mist rehearsing memory, drew a narrow stitch across the water, as if mending a tear no eye could see. Scholars would someday discuss ignis fatuus and the chemistry of marsh breath, respectful as surgeons, yet even they might admit that on certain nights explanation feels like a coat tried on over a heartbeat, rather than the heartbeat itself. At the widow's cottage, the rosemary steam of afternoon had long since turned to sleep, but the latch, made wise by many hands, rested as a kindly sentinel, and the little plate where soul cakes had been placed stood empty, with the contentment of dishes that have fulfilled a vow. The steward of the mill crossed the common, counting habit by habit, door, gate, hedge, well, as a shepherd counts sheep by listening for the absence of bleats. The well held its coin of moonlight with such humility you might have missed its pride. The masks that had hung over the fence had gone indoors, and the fence itself wore only dew, which suits a fence fine, From a far lane came a small clatter, no taller than a cat, and then the hush with which a cat disowns its noise. The watchman, patient as bread, held his lamp so that its circle did not interrogate but invited, an art learned by old friends and good priests, and the hedges, flattered, confessed nothing. Above the roofs, a rook shook 2 deliberate wing beats, as if wedging the night more snugly into place, and settled. The bell, woolen once more, refused to speak, not from neglect, but because silence had the floor. The librarian, not sleeping yet, turned a page in the refectory and found at the margin a dry petal pressed by some conscientious hand before his own time. Rose or mallow, he could not say. He liked that it had gone on being leaf-shaped without insisting on a name, and he closed the book softly so as not to bruise what centuries had left intact. In the guest cell, the pilgrim from the north, salted with miles, lay awake, listening to the valve-like hush of the abbey breathing. He thought of other valleys, where the quarrel between spectacle and festival had been argued with more scolding than song, and he smiled to have wandered into a place where the quarrel wore slippers and accepted soup, where debates about pumpkins and turnips shared a bench with prayers, and nobody minded whose cloak was borrowed by whom. At the edge of the moor, where habit thins and the imagination grows its heathery coat, a thin fog worked at the path like a quiet needle. There were tales, the watchman knew, of a rider who passed without hoofprints, and of a hound who served only to show safer ground. Stories laughed at by day and listened to by night, and he allowed them room beside his lamp without asking for papers. The prior, returning from his last small patrol of drafts and hinges, paused by the ledger under the yew. He did not open it, but laid his hand upon the cover, feeling the stored warmth of names rise into his palm like a shy bird. He thought, not to be clever, but to be honest, that keeping and releasing are neighbours, and that All Hallows and All Souls are not 2 houses, but the same doorway seen from opposite sides. Far in the orchard, a ladder stood again, against nothing, the tree having generously given its fruit. The ladder, unburdened, appeared to be listening for a voice that might ask it to serve in some other parable before the frost seized its rungs. An owl, parsimonious with syllables now, drafted 1 round note and let it roll into the lanes where it knocked on no door. Inside the cottages, sleep loosened laces and smoothed foreheads. A child, who had once asked whether the wind could carry a name, dreamed a mild procession of letters walking hand in hand along the pond's rim, each letter a lantern, each lantern a face he might some day love or remember. Across the green, the mason's wife, champion of equal dances, dreamed of tables without head or foot, and woke briefly long enough to turn her pillow and consent to mourning. The village dog, belonging to everybody and thus to no one, took up his post on a threshold that had never refused him and pressed his chin to the wood as if listening to the grain's long autobiography. Somewhere in his old democratic ribs, he kept track of which feet belonged to which voices and which voices to which kindnesses, and he slept exactly that deeply. Near midnight the wind found a new consonant and sounded it softly against the shutters. The pond changed its opinion about how many moons were necessary and settled for 2. And over the church the stars made that ancient compromise between distance and company, shining in a way that felt less like display and more like steady attendance. In the side chapel, wax cooled in thin collars around the wicks. In the kitchen, a spoon, left thoughtfully in the bowl, leaned as if listening for the recipe to remind it of itself. In the little library, the pressed pedal breathed with page and wood and ash and patience. The watchman came to the open doorway at last, the one left ajar like a pulse, and stood within the margin of its light, not to guard it, but to share it. The flame leaned toward him, and he toward it, both companions to a silence that behaved like a good guest. He did not close the door. Doors, like hearts, sometimes pray best when not latched, and so the hour slipped forward on quiet feet, past the yew that remembered more than it told, past the ledger that warmed without opening, past the pond admiring itself moderately, past the hedges that kept the punctuation of the day, until the village lay under its coverlet of dark and breath and small faithful sounds. At the farthest field's edge, where the moor takes back the path, a breath of light, only a breath, rose as if to test the weather of tomorrow, and then, satisfied or shy, drew down again. The doorway's flame quivered, listening. Somewhere a fox stitched two shadows together with its tail. And the night, pleased with its own careful keeping, held everything just so, open enough for wonder, closed enough for rest, while at the threshold where lamplight met the uncounted dark, a moth arrived late and beat a quiet powdery hymn against the glass, as if spelling a message no one would read until morning. Toward the hour when clocks forget their shoulders, and the dark lifts like a blanket's edge to check the sleeping room, a slight weather gathered over the moor, a fine, sifted mist that behaved as if it had rehearsed all week for this quiet entrance. The watchman felt it first, cool as a thoughtful hand at the brow. He tipped his lamp a little, not to push anything back, but to let the circle of gentleness travel with him along the hedge where spider webs, overnight embroideries, caught dew as if the air had sown itself with beads. The village lay in that profound consent, which is not silence, but many low yeses stacked together. Roof, beam, kettle, heart, the pond. Content, at last, with 2 moons, held steady, and the yew kept its tall green secrecy, like a choir boy promising not to whisper. Inside the nave, where the doors had been left on the latch with the trust of good neighbours, wax collars greeted the draught with a faint bee's memory. The ledger on its little table was warm where a palm had lately rested, and beside it someone, perhaps the librarian, perhaps a child, had placed the feather with the green river in it, as if to mark a page the night itself wished to reread. The prior stood for a time beneath St. Michael's patient half-eye. Thinking of thresholds, he considered how the feast of all known holiness leans into the remembrance of all the unknown, as a lamp leans toward a window so that both room and lane can borrow its light. He did not name it theology. He named it neighbourliness, and the word fitted, plain wood to plain hinge. Outside, the lanes carried the small autobiography of the hour, the scuff of a boot, learning to place itself lightly, the 3-part rhythm of a fox being sure, a mended gate experimentally creaking once, as if reminding itself it had returned from mischief to duty. At the brook, the widow's window kept its modest glow, a hush that felt like company. She dreamed, if that can be recorded by any ledger, of a field on which names rose like larks and settled again, not obliged to stay, but welcome to linger where the air made room. Across the green, a travelling pilgrim, salt still in the wool at his cuffs, woke briefly, and hearing the bell not ring, smiled. He had come from valleys, where this night had sharper edges, where bonfires wore their brightness like armour, where debate about origins held the table long after bread had cooled. Here, the quarrel between spectacle and festival had yawned, and found it was comfortable to doze side by side, and the pilgrim loved the hospitality of that. Scholars, arguing in rooms with earnest windows, would continue their careful arithmetic about roots and branches, how turnip faces claimed the sill before pumpkins learned the door, how souling traded verses with psalms until each kept a little of the other's accent. The village, without refusing such ledgers, simply practiced the arithmetic of hands, door on the latch, bread on the plate, candle at the glass. The librarian, who had closed his book to spare the petal any further labour, went out to the charnel house with the steady courage of someone bringing a cup to a friend who sits up late. Inside, Bone kept its quiet semester, rows upon rows of lessons without scolding, and the painted dance, kings and millers, abbots and laundresses, had shifted again, by Shadow's law, into something like a countryside wedding where everyone agrees to know the steps. He stood there long enough for mist to gather at the doorway like an usher, and thought, not unhappily, about the mercy of levelling truths. He did not fear the sight. Humility abridges fear. And when he went out, he left the lamp with a respectful nod, as if saying, "Teach us to be even," and Bone, being excellent teachers, said nothing and agreed. On the far lane, the steward of the mill counted gates a second time, not distrusting his first answer, but savouring the pleasure of finding the village correct. He paused where the hedges grew honest and low, and saw, only for a breath, a pale wick of light lifting from the reed beds, not so much shining as remembering how to. He could have called it gas, he could have called it grace, and in this valley neither word would have quarrelled with the other. He tipped his cap, and the light, polite as any guest, lowered its head in return and let the mist wear it. Beneath the yew, the prior found the watchman and the novice sharing a quiet that looked like kinship. They spoke of small matters, the ladder in the orchard, the cat who denies its own clatter, the fox whose tail is a needle-sewing path to path, and then, as talk sometimes does when it has been kind, they allowed it to fold itself neatly and be still. The prior said, without sermon, that tomorrow they would read the basket of letters at table, not aloud but attentively. Mercy does not need volume if it has hands. The novice, who kept 2 pockets, one for worries and one for wonder, touched the one with wonder and asked whether doors left ajar ever grow tired. The watchman answered that doors like hearts rest best when trusted. The prior added that latches too enjoy being useful only sometimes. A rook passed above, invisible, but riding the air with a confident pen. A late apple let go of its twig without drama and arrived on the grass with the sound of a soft decision. Somewhere a shudder spoke the consonant. The wind had been practising, and satisfied at last, fell quiet. The pond, practising honesty, allowed a little ripple to declare itself before smoothing the page. In that ripple, for a blink, the 2 moons became 4, and then the mathematics returned to Mercy's usual sum. In the guest cell, the pilgrim turned to face the wall, which had learned a number of psalms by heart without ever saying so. He slept, and his travelling shell dreamed of a coast it had not yet visited. The monk with the ledger, woken by habit to make sure nothing had been forgotten, padded barefoot to the nave and lifted the book. He did not open it. He only moved it into a beam of mist-dimmed moon so that, should anything without hands wish to read, the page would be ready in spirit if not in ink. He felt again the weight that is not heaviness, the way names become warm stones when kept for the right reason, and he set the book down with the care one gives to creatures that do not require cages. All through the cottages, breath stacked into sleep like folded linen. The village dog rearranged his paws, and, In a democracy of dreams, chased no one. The hedges kept their punctuation. The moor breathed its long, level sentence that never needs a period. And just before whatever hour chooses dawn each day, when the sky first thinks of a seam, and the frost first supposes it might write its small silver alphabets, the open doorway by the lane did a gentle thing. Its flame, having kept attendance like a faithful clerk, leaned once toward the dark, as if to kiss the cheek of night, and then, with a courteous bow, shortened itself to a coal. The glass kept the print of the moth's powder, a pale signature that would mean nothing to noon and everything to those who knew. The latch, pleased with its vigil, breathed the smallest relief, and at the river bend, where reeds practice cursive and lights practice their manners, a thread of brightness rose, wrote something tender and illegible across the mist, and drifted on, toward the hedges, toward the brook, toward a horizon that was already deciding whether to belong to evening's memory or morning's first shy word. Dawn stitched a pale hem along the hills, and the frost, pleased to be apprenticed to the morning, wrote its tidy alphabets across the grass and the low thatch. The bell took up a cleaner thread and let one note wander the rooftops. Smoke answered in soft cursive, and shutters, remembering their good manners, opened with the deference of eyelids greeting day. In the refectory the brothers set the plain table, as if laying out a map of kindness. Loaves, divided with a cross that looked more like a path than a boundary. Bowls of porridge steam-breathing like small animals. A pot of rosemary sprigs that the kitchen sister had tucked there because fragrance, too, can be a guest. When they had eaten enough to warm their thinking, the prior drew the basket of folded papers near, and rather than reading them aloud as if they were announcements, placed a handful at each setting so that every pair of hands could become a pair of eyes. The rustle was gentle, like wind turning the pages of a hedge. A brother's slip said, in writing as square as a field, for a sister on the road. Another wore only a picture of a cow with an improved expression. One said, "I forgive him," and someone else, unstartlingly, laid a palm on that paper for a breath, as if helping it carry itself. The librarian found again the feather with the green river in it, and used it to mark a page that had no ink, only attention. The novice, whose pockets still held worry and wonder in equal measure, discovered a child's drawing of two circles touching, and understood, without argument, that mercy grows exactly there. Outside, the village went about its bright housekeeping with the care of people who have found that grief is less heavy when the broom is in hand. Hearth ash carried to the garden, a shawl shaken over the lane, buckets brought to the pump, where the first sunlight painted brass with quiet ceremony. The widow by the brook warmed yesterday's bread on an iron and poured hot water over a single green word of rosemary. She stood at the window and thanked the latch for its night's steadiness. Then, remembering, placed 3 crumbs on the sill for birds who haven't learned to knock. Up the lane, the steward of the mill turned his rounds into visiting, not with chatter but with presence. He checked a gate hinge that had taken to creaking as if it wanted to be included in every sentence, oiled it until it remembered how to listen, then went on to the pond where 2 moons had finally agreed to be one again, and the water wore its reflection like a well-kept promise. The ewe, tall archivist of both hush and rumour, received the morning as if a fresh page had been slipped beneath its roots. Beneath it the ledger rested, and the sacrist, mindful of pages that warmed themselves, opened it only long enough to tuck in the petal the librarian had spared last night. The rose, or mallow, that had practised being leaf-shaped for a century without complaint. On the green, Yesterday's mummers fetched their linen masks from the peg, where drying had made them momentarily stern. The boys rolled up the little stage carpet and returned borrowed stools to doorways, their hands discovering how the end of a thing also asks for tenderness. A pilgrim, salted still at cuffs and hem with other roads, came to the prior to offer thanks and a gift, not of relic, but of recipe, a way of braiding turnip and flour into a cake that could be eaten warm by any door. Whether the custom belonged first to his valley or theirs seemed to him like arguing over the parentage of kindness, and the prior, delighted by the principled refusal of that quarrel, pressed into the pilgrim's palm a ribbon from the ledger's spine, a bookmark for places where mercy will need saving. Scholars, when they visit valleys like this, love to measure. They will ask when lanterns first learned to smile in pumpkin skin, whether souls first knocked with rhyme or with bread, and whether the painted dance took its steps from plague years or from a deeper appetite for equal footing. The village keeps its patience for such arithmetic, but this morning it counted other sums. How many bowls to wash? How many names in the head to bring beside the grave? How many doors to leave a little wider when daylight turns to its quieter half? In the charnel house, Bone held its school with unembarrassed calm, and the painted ring of dancers, kings and millers, bishops and laundresses, had found another expression in the light, less warning than accompaniment. The librarian, passing through with a broom, saluted them as colleagues in the craft of levelling. By mid-morning, the path to the churchyard drew a mild procession, boots in the frost, soft grass, shawls buttoned against a small breeze that insisted on being somewhere helpful. People carried not crowns but sprigs, not speeches but mending, a seam to retie in the fence of memory, a stone to rub clean with the patient thumb of recollection. The prior spoke very little at the blessing, for the day had its own language. He only said that names are doors, and the heart learns to walk through them both ways, that All Saints has wide sleeves, so it can lend one to All Souls, that keeping and letting go are neighbours who share herbs over the wall at supper time. An old quarrel about pumpkins versus turnips, revived for warmth, ended as it should, with a pie, pumpkin, given to the widow in a lantern, turnip, hung at the church door, both grinning the same gentle grin, as if to say the point was never victory, but light. A fox stitched the meadow's edge to the hedgerow with neat amber thread. Above, a rook drew 3 strokes across the sky and put down the pen. At the orchard, the idle ladder straightened a little, as though remembering that service must include rest if it is to keep its balance. The watchman, dismissed to daylight but too companionable with his rounds to abandon them, walked once more to the river bend. Reeds wrote in cursive, a pale seam of light, only a persuasion now, not a proof, lifted briefly and settled, like a letter folded for later reading. He tipped his cap again, neither to science nor to magic, but to the kind of courtesy that keeps both from loneliness. Noon came quietly, warm as fresh bread in a cloth, and the village accepted it without ceremony. The mill chuckled, the pond kept its one moon, the hedges recited their punctuation properly. And in the nave, St. Michael, still missing half an eye, and none of his patience, watched over a basket now lighter by prayers carried off in pockets. Afternoon would lean, as it does, toward the slower tasks, mending, sweeping, writing short letters that say only arrived safely and mean still learning how to be alive. And evening would return with its shawl of lamps. But for this hour the valley held its breath in a way that felt not like waiting, but like gratitude stretched to its comfortable length. And far out on the moor, where the ground thinks in long sentences and refuses to hurry to the period, the mist rehearsed a new grammar of light. It rose and drifted and thinned, as if some old companion were practicing the art of approaching without startling, coming nearer by degrees, until hedge and brook and door and the palm resting on the ledger would feel the nearness and look up, smiling, before they quite knew why. Afternoon lengthened its vowels, and the valley answered by lowering its voice, the way a kindly room hushes when someone begins to tell the part of a story that matters. The brothers took up small labours, adaptable to thought, mending a hem with even stitches, scraping wax from a stone sill, sorting candles by the way their wicks remembered flame, while the librarian, in the windowed corner, arranged a few notes for no audience but the future, writing not conclusions but questions folded like swallows' wings. On the green, the weaver and the mason resumed their cheerful tug of war over origins. Was the painted dance born of plague and repentance, or of an older appetite for equality that simply found its moment? They did not expect to win. Winning would have ended the conversation, and it was the company they liked. The way a good quarrel, kept warm and salted with laughter, can feed a winter. The prior passed, heard them, and offered only a hand on each shouldered sleeve, as if blessing the permission to differ. When he had gone, the weaver softened. Perhaps the first painter knew both storms, she said, and the mason grunted assent, discovering that agreement can be as comfortable as a well-worn bench. The widow by the brook took down her husband's old hat and brushed it as one brushes memory toward kindness. She stood a moment in the doorway, feeling how grief, dressed in daylight, is simply love that has learned to walk more slowly. At her sill, crumbs vanished one by one beneath the neat grammar of sparrows, and the house, encouraged, remembered a tune it hadn't hummed since spring. She let the kettle sing along and placed a rosemary sprig in the steam for the sake of indoor weather. Up at the river bend, the watchman, relieved of official rounds but loyal to unranked errands, inspected the reeds as if reading an old friend's handwriting. Nothing shone, nothing insisted, and yet he lifted his cap in habit and hope, a salute to phenomena that declined to become proof. The pilgrim, his shell now threaded to a fresh ribbon from the ledger, helped a farmer carry a sack of flour to the mill and learned the valley's version of doctrine, that doors open best on hinges oiled by use, that candles teach the dark manners but never contempt, that turnips and pumpkins, like theories, should be judged by how warmly they light a face. In the charnel house, the air kept its linen coolness, and bone held class without scolding. The painted ring of dancers looked gentler than at dawn, as if some shadow had moved its chair and given the figures more space to breathe. A novice swept with strokes measured to the pulse of his own breath and thought, without daring to say it aloud, that he could love the truth more easily if it sometimes wore this voice. Near the orchard, the idle ladder, which had practiced rest with unusual discipline, was finally leaned against a wall so a child might tie a faded ribbon to a nail above the cottage door. For luck, the child explained solemnly, though luck, overhearing, pretended not to listen. A rook crossed the sky with 3 decisive beats, punctuation large enough to settle the afternoon. Down on the lane, the pond, content with one moon for now, kept a glassy sermon on sufficiency, while 2 boys, at its edge, floated leaf boats bearing cargoes of small imaginary saints, rescued from gutter floods and appointed to new vocations as ferry captains. The prior, walking the boundary between hedge and field where customs like to grow, paused at a low stone wall and laid his palm on its warmed spine. He thought of names as doors, and doors as names, and of how this long hinge, All Hallows tipping into All Souls, had turned again, with neither groan nor squeal, only the honest weight of love crossing a threshold. He wondered, gently, the way one wonders about whether next year the lanterns would be more orange or more ivory, whether the lads would carry more gates or more songs, whether scholars would collect a new footnote that pleased the librarian's tidy soul. He smiled to find none of it urgent, only companionable. Toward vespers, the valley gathered itself, yarn wound, loaves cooled, a scuffle of broom on doorstep, a child practicing the old souling rhyme under his breath until the tune remembered him back, the steward of the mill, content, straightening the sign so it no longer leaned like an old idea. The nave inhaled lamplight. St. Michael, staunch in his half-seeing, wore the hour without complaint. And on the side table, the ledger lay in the soft posture of a book that understands being opened is not the only way to be read. Fingers remember weight, and weight is a kind of sentence. When psalms were done, slow tied against the ribs, then home, the brothers filed out under a sky with peach along its hem. Mist rehearsed the evening's choreography at the field edge, curtsying to hedges that had served as pews for so many wind-borne sermons. A quiet procession went by the widow's door. No one knocked, yet she felt company pass and smiled in that unperformed way doors understand. She set one more crumb for the birds of tomorrow, which is to say, for hope. After supper, a bold tasting of herbs that prefer to be noticed rather than named, the librarian unfolded his small sheaf of questions and read them to the prior by the refectory window. How to hold both Samhain and All Saints without making either a museum. How to teach children to fear only what asks them to be cruel. How to remember the dead without binding them to our furniture. The prior answered in the manner of kitchens, with a cloth smoothed, with a chair set right, with a remark so ordinary it became true. We do the next kind thing and let the mystery sit with its tea. The watchman returned, bearing a rumour. At the river bend, a thin seam had lifted at dusk, not bright but attentive. It had hovered like a thought remembering itself, and then walked downstream with polite feet. He told it without claim, the way one reports a fox's path. No one tried to catch the tail with a net of certainty. Nets tear in such water. Instead, the room consented to a small, unanimous quiet, the sort that makes room for both daylight chemistry and night's shy visitations to share a bench. Later, when work had thinned to the whisper of cooling pans and stacked bowls, the village stepped back into the air, the yew, evergreen archivist, or the last light like a ribbon. The green held a faint map of earlier laughter. The pond rehearsed how many stars it could carry without boasting. Doors settled to their latches as if concluding a paragraph. Windows learned their modest glow. The ladder, unburdened again, leaned into a respectable idleness. Somewhere beyond the moor, a rook wrote its period on the sky. And as the first patient dark stitched itself between cottage and hedge, the painted dancers in the charnel house seemed, by some mercy of angle, to turn outward, hands extended, not to summon, but to accompany. The novice, locking the door, felt his shoulder lighten as if a long coat had been lifted. He looked toward the river, where reeds wrote cursive no eye can fully pronounce. He thought he saw, just beyond the bend, a filament of remembering loosen from the water's hem, wavering like a candle that has learned to move without wicker hand. He said nothing, and the nothing felt kind, Above him the yew kept its ink-scent promise, beneath him the earth kept its steady breath, and along the lane a faint, courteous brightness began, careful as a guest removing boots, to approach the village, not yet arriving, only considering arrival, while every door, taught by the season, practiced the art of opening by degrees. Evening returned like a careful tailor, fitting the valley to its softer outline, and the first lamps in cottage windows appeared as stitches catching cloth to cloth. The yew stood in its familiar posture of listening, resin scent rising as if the tree were rereading a favourite page. Beneath it, the ledger rested warm from hands earlier in the day, its ribbon marking not a chapter but a kindness paused and ready to resume. In the refectory, bowls had been washed to the clean, bell-like sound good crockery makes when content. The kitchen sister set 3 extra slices of bread beneath a cloth, for whoever late comes honest, she said, meaning, as she often did, almost everyone. The watchman began his unranked rounds with a lamp that behaved like patience on a hook. He nodded to the pond, which had found enough stars for grace, but not for vanity, and to the mill door, where flower dust slept in its soft congregation. Along the lane, the widow stepped into the doorway to let the last of day's air pass through her rooms. She felt the change in the light, the way a hand feels a change in cloth, a finer weave, a deeper colour. And with that domestic courage grief slowly teaches, she placed a sprig of rosemary on the mantel and whispered the name she used to say aloud without trembling. At the green's edge, boys recovered their linen masks from where sun had finished smoothing them. They held the faces up to the failing light and laughed at how expressions change when no one is inside them, then folded the cloth carefully, for even foolishness deserves a drawer. The weaver and the mason met again at the bench that preferred their company, let their debate idle like a cart in neutral. They spoke, instead of repairs, the winter would ask, of roofs, and of the newly respectful gate that had chosen duty after a generation's career in mischief. The weaver touched the bench's scar and said, "All our answers are only stitches. What matters is whether they hold through weather." And the mason, agreeable in the way evening makes a man, said, "I will mortar that truth tomorrow," and meant it. The prior, walking with the librarian and the novice toward the river bend, kept his hands in his sleeves against the crispness that had learned to pronounce itself. They spoke of letters in the basket, the picture of a cow improved by hope, the unadorned sentence of forgiveness that seemed to make the room larger, and of how some prayers travel best when folded small and carried in the pocket until the hand warms them brave. At the bend, the reeds rehearsed their cursive, and the water read itself without haste. Then, so modestly that even the watchman's lamp hesitated to agree, a slim seam of brightness loosened from the damp and rose, like a thread choosing to be seen. No one advanced. A silence, courteous and exact, took its place among them, as if invited. The novice's breath made a fog coin that spent itself and was not missed. The librarian leaned, not forward but inward, to keep his bookish heart from picking up a quill it did not need. The light did not flare. It learned their faces the way a cat learns a room, by circling without offence. It hovered near the water, as though remembering a task, and the prior, who named very few things, allowed himself a word the valley would not quarrel with, attendance, only that, no sermon stitched to it. Behind them, evening expanded along the hedges with the measured confidence of a choir that has found its pitch. In the charnel house, the lamp brightened by a courtesy of wick and oil, and the painted ring of dancers seemed, by some indulgence of angle, to open a hand to the door, rather than keep time only for the walls. The novice, unable to pretend he was not a creature of questions, asked in a voice small enough to respect the air whether such lights came to fetch or to bless. The librarian smiled without showing his teeth and said, "When a guest brings neither bag nor book, perhaps it comes to keep us company, while we remember how to speak gently," and the prior added, "and to remind us that doors no more than hinges." The light shifted, not nearer, not farther, just more sure of itself, and the watchman, who trusted usefulness over definition, lowered his lamp, the width of a breath, offering space as one offers a chair. Across the green, the village dog took up his post on a friendly threshold and considered the night with the expertise of one who knows every footfall by its grammar. He did not bark, which in this place was as eloquent as any welcome. The widow, who had closed her eyes to steady a memory, opened them and saw nothing but the good emptiness of a room that had consented to peace. Still, she felt what the lanes felt, the lifting of some tender hinge, and she set a cup on the sill just inside the window as if to teach her hands to trust full places again. The weaver and the mason, idling at their bench, saw nothing of reeds or light, yet the weaver stopped mid-sentence and pressed her palm to her chest, as if a name had stepped back into the room with its shoes off, and the mason, startled at his own softness, said he might repair the widow's lintel first, and only then the abbey step. He did not say why. In the nave, St. Michael's patient half-eye made peace with the dimness. Wax collars glowed the way old beeswax remembers summer. The ledger, on its table beneath the yew-shadowed window, kept the warmth of earlier hands as surely as a loaf keeps oven weather, and if any page stirred, it was only the ribbon practising a small bow. The light, having tested its manners on water, made one unhurried drift toward the bank and paused at the old plank bridge. There, like a letter considering which pocket to fit, it leaned toward the lane and then towards the brook, as if measuring where the company was best kept in one place or shared among many. The prior whispered nothing. Silence can be a word when offered honestly, and the librarian held his bookish impulse at bay by counting his breaths in a language he did not know but trusted. The novice, who had put equal coins of fear and hope into his mouth and found both melted to the same sweetness, stood very still and let the world decide what it wished to do. From the orchard, the ladder, employed earlier to lift ribbon and luck, looked pleased with its second vocation as a witness. A single apple, late to choose, dropped without fuss and rolled to a stop against the plank's worn toe, as if to say, "I too have arrived." The light did not enter the village like news. It accompanied the hour like memory, not asking to be believed, only to be kept company. It grazed a reed top, so that a tremor travelled outward like a small rumour learning good manners. It touched no more than a moth would, the air above the plank, and then, with that courtesy the valley had come to recognise, began to turn back toward the river, as though it had remembered that returning is also a form of blessing. They watched, not to hold it, but to learn how to let. The watchman lifted his lamp again, only enough to guide them home by a path that already knew their feet. The prior inclined his head to something not quite visible. The librarian, emboldened by humility, said he might write nothing about it and be correct. And the novice, left with his burning pockets, found that worry had moved over to make more room for wonder. Doors would be set gently on their latches. The pond would offer exactly as many stars as were needed and no more. The widow's cup would warm a small square of air, and the painted dancers, behind their cool stone neighbour, would keep time soft enough for sleep. And out at the bend, as mist practice being letter and river practice being page, that thread of brightness, obedient to its own kindness, slid back along the water's grammar, leaving behind, here and there, the faintest suggestion that hedges might be listening, and that a ledger, under a tree that knows ink by breath, was ready to remember whatever came next. Night's second patience arrived without fanfare, the kind of dark that remembers shoes at the door and does not step on sleeping floors. Lamps blinked into their small duties, and the hedges, pleased to be confided in, rehearsed their soft spelling of the lane. The watchman moved again, with his lamp, like a tame star cupped in brass, unimportant to the sky and essential to the ground. He nodded to the mill where flower dust, a quiet congregation, kept vigil over the bench. He paused by the pond, which, honest as ever, carried only the stars it could keep, without boasting, and one deliberate moon that behaved like a guest who never spills. In the nave, the brothers set out 2 fresh tapers the way a mother sets out 2 clean cups, not expecting visitors and not wishing to shame them if they come. St. Michael's patient half eye, missing nothing it needed, stood guard over a silence that had learned to purr. The ledger lay closed, warm-backed as a cat on a hearth, ribbon peeking like a tongue of promise. Outside, the weaver and the mason sat on their bench and let their favourite argument idle in the yard, like a cart after market. Having stitched the day's edges with decent work, they gave themselves the luxury of agreeing that origins are often cousins sharing coats. Plague and old equality, Samhain and All Hallows, each borrowing the other's sleeve in weather like this. The widow, coaxed by her own courage, lifted the window a finger's width to let the world pass through. She laid a crumb on the sill, as if teaching the house a tiny lesson in hospitality, and breathed a rosemary breath into the room the way a person blesses without the name for blessing. The pilgrim, salted at cuff and seam by roads that had tried to keep him, lay awake in the guest cell, counting not miles but courtesies, doors that consented to ajar, bowls that made room for one more ladle, faces that dimmed their brightness to share the darkness fairly. He thought of verses learned in other valleys, and of how this place spoke the same grammar with a kinder accent. Toward the river bend, the reed beds, diligent scribes wrote their cursive on the night again. The water book and page together turned the leaves with a hush. The prior walked there with the librarian and the novice, not to petition but to listen. He carried no sermon, only sleeves and presents. The librarian, who could hear a footnote in the flight of a moth, held his mind as still as he could manage. The novice, pockets hot with wonder, whispered a single word into them, gentle, as if naming the coin could cool it. And there, as though night were carefully repeating itself so a child might learn the line, a thread of brightness lifted from the seam where damp becomes air. It did not ask to be believed. It did not ask anything at all. It stood the way a courtesy stands, offered without expectation, ready to take its leave, unharmed by refusal. The watchman, arriving by a sensible path, shifted the lamp down and to the side, so the stranger light would have room to speak in its own alphabet. He did this without thinking, as one makes way for a neighbour at the gate. Kindness is only clumsy when it is new, and here it had the steady wrists of habit. In the charnel house, the painted dancers, who had worn the day like a shawl and the evening like a rumour, seemed by angle and wick to step outward once more, Their skeletal hands, free of rank and title, made a ring that looked less like a warning and more like permission, a soft curriculum in levelling truths. The librarian, in a voice so low the moth would not be startled, recited what he had decided to forget to write. 2 circles touching, dark and bright, and beneath them, in a script the birch bark had taught him, where they meet, mercy grows. The prior smiled, not with mouth but with posture, the way a room smiles when a chair is drawn exactly where it belongs. He said nothing, and felt that nothing say everything. Along the green, the village dog shifted on his threshold and sorted the footsteps he could hear from the ones he could only feel. He did not bark. Acquaintance does not always require noise. Across the lane, the mummer's folded masks, stored in a drawer where fools rest between seasons, dreamed of eyes and laughter without rousing anyone. The weaver touched the bench scar again and decided tomorrow's mend could be larger than the rip. The mason, hearing his own thought before it made a sound, chose the widow's lintel as his morning prayer. Promises spoken softly travel farther. Overhead, a rook stitched 3 neat strokes into the cloth of sky and put its needle away. The wind found its consonant again, but pronounced it kindly. An apple, late to certainty let go, wrote a single period in the grass and rolled just far enough to suggest, without insisting, that stories are round. The light, having learned the map of reeds and plank and bank, leaned toward the lane by an inch, a generosity, not a trespass, and backed away, like a guest who knows the hour, leaving behind only the good rumour that hedges can listen and doors can think. The novice, braver now because the dark had not demanded bravery, asked whether blessings ever arrive without owners. The librarian answered that some do their best work unclaimed. The prior added that a blessing with a name is useful, but a blessing with no name fits every pocket. They turned homeward by the path that remembers feet. The watchman counted the usual sheep of the village, door, gate, pond, well, and found no strays. In the nave, the fresh tapers stood, like 2 white throats ready to sing if asked. The ledger waited without impatience, a harbour that does not pursue boats. At the widow's window, steam from the cup her hands had finally trusted the house to hold, made a small aurora against the pane. A sparrow, impertinent and correct, inspected the sill for the lesson in crumbs. The latch, flattered by the night's reliance, rehearsed its easy lift. Inside the refectory, a spoon leaned where someone had left it to listen. Wax collars around the wicks remembered summer and were in no hurry to forget. The pedal the librarian had housed between pages breathed its dry, faithful fragrance into the long patience of paper. Not far off, the mill signed the lane with the little arithmetic of wheel and stone. The orchard ladder kept its respectable idleness. The hedges, punctuation masters, set commas where the lane asked to breathe, and out by the bend, where water writes and mist edits, the thread of brightness bent once more to its lesson and slid, obedient to its own kindness, along the river's grammar until the night wore it like a quiet seam. The prior lifted his head, as if to catch a word that had chosen not to be spoken. The librarian counted his breaths and forgot the number and felt improved by losing. The novice found his pockets cooler and his steps unafraid. And the village, under a sky that had taken off its jewellery to sleep, lay with doors taught to yield and windows taught to glow, while beyond the hedges, at the low listening edge of moor and water, something almost seen practised arrival again, and again, as if it, too, were learning the courtesy of being kept company. Toward the deep middle of the night, an hour that wears no number, only a hush, the village settled as if a careful hand had smoothed the quilt and patted the corners. The watchman, faithful to his small star in brass, turned along the hedge where Dew had written beads on spider silk. He counted, as always, the ordinary flock of things, door, gate, pond, well, and found them present, which is how peace keeps its roll. The mill's faint arithmetic tapped once and rested. Flower dust lay like a congregation that prefers to pray seated. The pond, modest and exact, kept its one moon and as many stars as would not trouble the water's temper. And at the river bend, where reeds practice cursive and mist edits generously, a thread of brightness rose again, unhurried, unboastful, no more than a candle learning to walk. It stood, not on bank or board, but in that slim grammar between, and behaved as attendance behaves, offered without demand. The watchman lowered his lamp by a breath to give it room, and the prior, arriving with the librarian and the novice, let his sleeves be his only ceremony. Nothing asked for proof, nothing provided it. The light drifted the measure of a single thought toward the plank bridge, then paused, as if reading the grain with a finger it did not have. A breeze from the orchard crossed the lane, carrying apple and iron, the memory of rungs, the honesty of tools, and the light inclined, the way a listener inclines, toward the village. On the green, the weaver and the mason had yielded to drowsing on the bench that knows their arguments. A rook above, seeing their peace, folded its wing beats into silence, like a letter it would post at dawn. In the widow's cottage, a cup warmed the sill with its small aurora. She slept, not far, not deep, like a harbour that keeps an ear for oars. Her husband's hat, brushed earlier into a kinder shape, kept its watch on a peg. Rosemary leaned from a jar like a green bookmark in the room's plain scripture. The light, polite as a guest that knows thresholds, came only to the glass. It did not knock, it did not peer, it leaned a softness against the pane, enough that the moth's powder print, the pale signature left from a former hour, took on the look of a blessing-receiving company. The latch, which understands its vocation, made no boast. The cup's steam offered nothing but warmth. The widow did not stir, and yet something in her breathing learned a slower syllable, as a river does, when frost first explains how to speak more carefully. Then, obedient to its own kindness, the light withdrew the way a word removes itself so a better word can arrive later. It moved along the lane, where hedges, surprised into courtesy, tilted their listening. The librarian pressed a sentence he would not write against his ribs. That companionship sometimes has no task but staying. The novice tasted fear and found it thin as old soup, tasted wonder and found it bread. They walked after the light, not to keep up, but to keep company. The prior let the night set the pace, one step to the pond's whisper, another to the fox's tidy commas in the dust, another to a shudder pronouncing its new consonant, very softly. In the charnel house, the lamp, patient pedagogue, held its lesson of equality. The painted dance, kings, millers, abbots, laundresses, by trick of angle offered an outward hand again, as if the wall itself were remembering to be a door. Bone kept its composure. Humility cancelled fear the way tea cancels the chill in a small room. The watchman, passing, touched the jam with a knuckle, a tradesman's benediction that leaves no mark and all the good. Past the orchard, the ladder kept its respectable idleness, yet seemed, by posture only, to approve of being useful again if asked. Luck, pretending not to listen, sat very still on the nail where the child's ribbon moved with a close breeze. The light tarried at the old plank bridge, and then, choosing the village in little draughts rather than a flood, slid toward the green. It grazed the bench where the weaver and the mason slept. Neither woke, but the weaver's hand opened as if releasing a thread no longer needed, and the mason's brow forgot an argument. It could resume easily in daylight. The village dog, proprietor of thresholds and expert in footsteps, lifted his head. He did not bark. He inhaled the rumour of mercy and lay down again very deliberately, as though not to frighten it. In the nave, the brothers had set 2 tapers for no one. They discovered they were for this, which is also no one and everyone. Wax collars remembered summer without disloyalty to frost. St. Michael, half-eyed and entire-hearted, watched as if guarding a silence that was learning a new key. The ledger on its side table kept a warmth not its own. The ribbon, modest tongue, made a small bow as draughts rearranged the nave's vowels. The light entered only as far as the threshold, which is where most honest revelations stop. It did not cross. It was content with the door's confession that it could open. The prior stood as gardeners stand when the first rain arrives, after a difficult noon, hands behind, spine eased, gratitude unspectacular. He borrowed no theology, but neighbourliness, and found it enough. The librarian thought of 2 circles touching, dark and bright, and the patient handwriting on birch bark. Where they meet, mercy grows. He did not reach for a quill. He let the sentence be true without being captured. The novice, whose pockets were finally more wonder than worry, heard himself whisper, "Thank you," without deciding who should receive it. Sometimes addresses are the bars that keep messages from flying. They waited until waiting was complete and emptiness had warmed to presence. Then the light made the courteous turn it always makes and drifted back toward the reed's cursive and the river's grammar. Nothing vanished. Something finished. They walked home, the long way on purpose, by the pond that had remembered not to boast, by the mill that had remembered to rest, by the hedge whose punctuation had grown generous. On the green, the weaver woke, and did not pretend she had not slept. The mason, opening one eye, said he would repair the widow's lintel at first light and mend the abbey step after. Doors before thresholds, he muttered, and the weaver agreed that this sounded like scripture, even if it was only common sense. In the cottage by the brook, the widow woke also, neither startled nor sad. She put her palm to the pane, where a faint coolness lingered, like the afterthought of a touch, and she smiled with the ordinary courage of someone who plans to bake 2 loaves when one would do. One for the house, one for the road. She set the dough to rise, with a sprig of rosemary near, which is how houses learn the scent of hope. Near the churchyard, the yew, ever the archivist, made its resin breath like ink drying. Beneath it, the ledger waited, harbour that never chases boats, and the bell, courteous seamstress of hours, held back its stitch a moment longer, as if letting the cloth of night finish its sentence before turning the hem to morning. If you had listened then at the river bend, you might have heard nothing, which is not the same as emptiness. Mist folded its letter, water signed its name with a slow flourish. A rook, knowing dawn was almost ready to speak, practiced one deliberate wing beat and saved the others. The watchman paused by the open doorway that always prayed best without a latch. He let his lamp share a small horizon with the candle's shorter flame, They lean toward one another like neighbours who have finally learned the same greeting. And the village, which had been gently companioned by a thread of brightness for 3 nights now, received its ordinary dark back with gratitude, doors consenting to rest, windows to glow, beds to keep the shapes of kindness until day returned. Far along the hedges, where the moor begins its low, faithful sentence, a breath of light considered the hour and chose not to insist. It let the east earn its seam, and when the bell at last took up its woolen note and set it carefully across the roofs, even the pond, sensible pond, gave one approving shiver. Dawn loosened a pale whisper from the hills. Steam climbed from a loaf like a recollection made edible. And somewhere between ledger and yew, between reed and plank, between the cup on the sill and the moth's powder print on the glass, a door that had practiced all night remembered how to open just enough for whatever was coming to find a welcome already shaped to its size. Morning came dressed in the colour of bread crust, warm and patient, and the bell stitched a low seam across the roofs as if hemming the night to keep it from unravelling too quickly. Steam rose from the first kettles like tidy ghosts unwilling to frighten anyone, and the pond, sensible, cooperative, kept a single, well-behaved moon in storage for evening while learning the daytime habit of sky. The yew breathed its resin counsel. Beneath it, the ledger lay calm as a cat after breakfast, ribbon peaking like a tongue of promise. And down the lane, where frost wrote careful letters upon the hedge, 2 figures walked with tools across their shoulders, one carrying a mallet, one a roll of linen, moving with that unhurried certainty by which a day declares its intention. The mason arrived first at the widow's door, honest as a weathered coin. The weaver came beside him, the folded cloth in her hands coloured the mild brown of practical mercy. They stood together a moment, as if listening for what the wood wished to say before anyone touched it. The lintel, blackened by years, but unbroken in spirit, seemed to straighten under their attention. "Doors before thresholds," the mason murmured, remembering his sleepy vow. The weaver, with a small nod, answered, "Stitches before songs," and set the cloth on the step as one lays a quiet blessing, where feet will find it without being told. They worked without spectacle. A wedge here, a line of chalk there, the mallet speaking its syllables into oak. When a sprig of rosemary fell from the mantle, the widow had tucked it there at dawn. The weaver set it in the lintel's crack as if teaching wood to remember green words. Inside, the widow shaped 2 loaves with hands that had learned again the rhythm of enough, one for the house, one for the road. Though whether the road led to the pilgrim's pack or to a neighbour's table she had not decided. Decisions, when kindly, keep company with bread until the last minute. The kettle's hum stitched the room together. The hat on the peg watched, if hats can watch, with a braver posture than yesterday, and the window, still holding the faint cool of a nocturnal courtesy, flashed once when the sun, tardy but sincere, found a corner of glass to practice on. Along the green, the watchman walked his daylight round. No lamp now, only that steady habit of notice that makes a man a hedge's friend. He greeted the pond, which replied by releasing exactly 1 ring of ripple, appreciative but not subservient. He saluted the mill, where flour dust rehearsed becoming bread in other houses, and he paused at the old bench where the weaver and the mason, in their hours off, kept the valley's oldest argument warm enough to welcome winter. Today, no argument, only tools, cloth, and a door reforming its memory of safety. The prior, sleeves folded like quiet doves, crossed the green with the librarian and the novice in his small parade. They had brought the basket of letters to the refectory, where light from the east window made saints of the dust motes. Now they returned it to the side chapel, much lighter in the hand because petitions, when read attentively, lose their weight and keep their warmth. In the charnel house, the lamp still held its low doctrine of equality. The painted ring of dancers, kings and millers, abbots and laundresses, by trick of mourning seemed to be practising a bow to the door, not as servants to a monarch, but as companions, acknowledging the next step. Scholars, if scholars had wandered here this hour, might have taken notes about harvest rites braided to holy days, about whether lantern faces were carved first from turnips or from pumpkins, about how will-o'-the-wisp seasons its chemistry with stories. The valley would not quarrel with the ink. Yet today the arithmetic preferred other sums. How many nails to set, how many crumbs to scatter for sparrows, how many names to carry in a pocket without bruising them. The librarian, who can love a footnote without letting it run the household, nodded to the graveyard wall as one nods to a neighbour who has been trimming hedges all morning. The novice, uncertain whether relief or wonder had grown larger in his pockets, touched both and discovered they had agreed to share. By mid-morning, the lintel stood truer than before, less a bar and more a welcome, its grain burnished with oil, and the weaver's cloth tacked neat along the inside seam. The widow pressed the second loaf into the mason's hands with that practised generosity that does not demand a story to justify itself. He tried to refuse, failed with grace, and promised to repair the abbey step after his midday soup. The weaver, cheeks brushed by the weather's honest pink, lifted her palm to the door and lightly, almost playfully, said, "There, you remember how—" and the latch flattered, lifted and settled with a sound that knew many hands. In the nave, the brothers gave Lords the modest strength it likes, no fanfare, no slackness, then set about their hospitable chores, sweeping the last of wax crumbs into a wooden hand's worth of patience, straightening hymn-boards, checking the two waiting tapers that had sung their silent duet with the night's shy brightness. St. Michael, half-eyed and never half-hearted, endured the morning with his ordinary kindness. The ledger, harbour that chases no boat, breathed a little resin-scented air from the yew-shadowed window and did not insist on being opened. Sometimes a book keeps better by keeping closed. On the green, a small parliament gathered, women mending with pleasant ferocity, men replacing a hinge on the gate that had lived too long in mischief, children sorting the virtues of leaf boats by the steadiness of their stems. The pilgrim contributed a story traded for apples. In his valley, the night between All Hallows and All Souls had grown less sharp over the years, not because people loved the dead less, but because they trusted the living more. He spoke of doors left on the latch without brag, of bowls of milk gone from threshold ritual to ordinary welcome, of arguments that learned slippers, soup, and mercy. The prior listened as a gardener listens to a description of rain in another climate. He said only, "Neighbourliness travels well," and the librarian wrote nothing and remembered everything. Toward noon, the reeds at the river bend appeared to be only reeds again, green quills riding a draught the wind would edit, yet the watchman, whose craft is companionship, walked there anyway and tipped his cap to whatever chooses sometimes to be seen and sometimes not. He found the plank bridge wearing its years with dignity. He found a single apple resting against the toe, as if punctuation had become a fruit. And after a time he found the sound of water saying the one syllable all rivers know, forward, without hurry. After the soup that always tastes faintly of herbs and patience, the mason kept to his promise to the abbey step. The stone accepted its new level without a lecture, and the prior, observing, made a note neither in the ledger nor in a book, but behind his ribs, where gratitude keeps its more durable ink. The novice standing by with broom and basin felt the school of his courage continue. Fear had become a smaller teacher. Wonder had hired a chair. Evening rehearsed itself at the edge of the fields, laying down a draught of rose and pewter. Weather vanes consulted with modest authority. The pond, pleased to be asked again, tried on a rehearsal moon and decided it could keep dance and rest in the same room. On the bench, argument stirred experimentally and then subsided. The weaver and the mason, for once content with having improved a thing that had asked to be improved, let their hands idle in their laps, as if allowing strength to walk barefoot before calling it back to harness. Vespers moved, like water over stones, soft insistence, old song. The two tapers answered the hour without need of spectacle, and in the side chapel, the basket of letters, lightened by sharing, looked as if it had learned a new way to sit. When the almonds settled into the nave's beams, people stepped into a dusk that had been combed smooth for them. Doors took up their small vocations. Windows rehearsed the glow that makes lanes polite to feet. The yew collected a little more ink from the sky, and then, without hurry, without drama, a gentle brightness, thin as a reed's idea of flame, gathered itself at the river bend as if reviewing notes. It did not come like news. It came like company, choosing a familiar route. The watchman saw first and did not call. Calling is a way of claiming. He simply turned his lamp so that its circle made space, and the prior, arriving with the librarian and the novice, stood as they had learned to stand, hands quiet, breath at the key of listening. The light moved by degrees, plank, bank, hedge, pausing at the widow's lintel long enough that the new oil caught a thread of brightness and wore it proudly. Inside she had set, in ordinary gratitude, a third loaf to cool on the table, one for the house, one for the road, one for the sudden guest who is not obliged to eat. She felt, without alarm, without conclusion, that the air near the door had remembered her name. She placed 2 cups upon the cloth, and after a harmless hesitation, filled both. Doors learn hospitality from the hands that touch them. From there the brightness walked, not farther in, not farther out, only along, grazing the bench where argument slept in good humour, companioning the pond until it found a count of stars that pleased it, visiting the abbey step as if to notarize the mason's pledge. It turned its polite face towards the charnel house, and by wick and angle the painted dancers seemed to offer a larger circle, one that could include those who stood outside the door with their breath tuned to a timid key. The novice, who had made a small practice of counting wing beats of rooks rather than reasons for fear, felt his pockets go cool and roomy. He whispered, to nobody's discomfort, "Thank you," and discovered the sentence did not require an address to be true. It would be pretty to say the light entered. It did not. Thresholds are teachers. They show how near can be enough. It lingered as a hush lingers, learned each hinge by name without insisting on proof, and then, obedient to its own kindness, began the turn that has become its custom. Back along the lane, down by the plank bridge, into the reed's patient handwriting, into the river's single-syllable promise. Nothing vanished. Something finished properly. The bell, waiting for the right seam, laid one woolen note upon the houses. The pond borrowed it, and gave it back, with a small shiver. The yew held the tone, in its needles like ink in a nib, and the ledger, warm-backed and unopened, kept the memory of all that had been said without saying. Doors drew themselves to, latches breathed, windows kept their gentle eyes, and out beyond the last hedge, where the moor begins its long, level sentence, a rook wrote an unshowy period upon the sky and put its pen away. While in the widow's kitchen 2 cups cooled side by side, and on the table a 3rd loaf waited without loneliness. For somewhere between the plank and the reed, between the cat soft knock of the mallet on oak and the choir soft hush of the nave, a company had grown, silent, exact, and generous, readying the valley for whatever small shining errand the next hour might ask of it. The day after did not arrive with a trumpet, but with the domestic kindness of a broom leaning where it belongs. Sunlight stepped into the valley as if wiping its feet on the doorstep, polite, not proud, and the hedges spelled their low, leafed alphabet, while the frost signed its brief name on the shadowed side of things, and then courteous as ever bowed away. The yew, tall archivist, breathed resin that smelled like ink, remembering exactly what it meant to say. Beneath its shade the ledger rested, warm-backed from yesterday's hands, its ribbon lying across the cover like a well-behaved thought that will speak when asked. At the pond, one practical goose paddled a tidy comma through the morning and left the sentence better punctuated. The mill offered the lane its quiet arithmetic of wheel and stone. Smoke from early hearths stood in the air, the way columns hold up a nave. Plain pillars of intention carrying roofs of stew and tea. The widow's door, newly truer in its frame, took its vocation seriously. When she opened it, the latch lifted like a small bow, well practiced. She placed one of yesterday's 3 loaves into a cloth-lined basket and set by it a sprig of rosemary, as if to remind bread what the word welcome smells like. She meant the loaf for the pilgrim, who would soon carry the valley's flavour to other roads. If he did not pass today, the loaf would find a neighbour instead. Mercy is not particular once it is baked. Inside, the hat on the peg watched those preparations with the restful posture of a grief that has chosen the chair nearest the window and discovered the view is gentler than it feared. She poured water over the herb and let the steam lace the kitchen with a thin, green clarity. When she raised the cup, her hand shook once, and then, learning from hinges, remembered how to be steady. On the bench by the green, the weaver and the mason allowed themselves a holiday from argument. They compared the patience of fibres to the patience of mortar, and admitted, each in the other's trade, that good work is how a place learns to hold itself together in weather. They eyed the repaired lintel across the lane, with a proprietary contentment, as if some afternoon light had chosen to sit there and behave well because their hands had taught the timber better manners. The mason promised to fit a new stone to the abbey step, where feet have told the same story for centuries, and worn their testimony into the grain. The weaver, smiling into her palm, as if adjusting a stitch in conversation, said that doors before thresholds had become a proverb she could live with, and the mason, who did not collect proverbs but respected those that mended, agreed. The prior walked the lane with the librarian and the novice, sleeves for once unneeded against the mildness. The basket of letters, now nearly empty, swung from the librarian's hand with the lightness of tasks completed without fanfare. They paused beneath St. Michael's patient half-eye to check the 2 tapers set aside for evening. Wax waited, like calm voices, in the throat. The prior said, not as a sermon, but as a recipe, that tonight they would read the last folded papers silently, then fold the silence back around the village so each door could wear it like a shawl. The novice, pockets comfortable with wonder and no longer crammed with worry, nodded as if someone had set a chair for him in a room he loved and left him to sit without supervision. Toward noon, the pilgrim came from the north path, salt lingering in the cuffs of his coat like a memory that enjoys small company, and received the loaf with the shy gratitude of those who understand the price of flour. He told in return a polite rumour from an upriver town that a wisp-lighted had followed their procession, not to frighten, but to keep the walking neat. That lamps in windows had learned the trick of leaning a little toward the street on All Souls, as if their glass had ears. That scholars there, too, argued in slippers where the turnip or pumpkin was older, and concluded, after soup, that the better lantern is the one a child can lift without fear. The prior smiled in that posture only way he favours, and sent the pilgrim with a sign traced in the air that was both blessing and neighbourly farewell. Afternoon extended its gentle syllables. The ladder in the orchard resumed its respectable idleness, pleased to be admired for nothing at all. A fox stitched the field's hem to the hedgerow with amber thread, and left no knot for trouble to catch on. A rook wrote 3 strokes in the pale sky, and pocketed its pen as if saving ink for dusk. In the charnel house, the lamp kept its school of equality. By the angle of light, the painted dancers, kings and millers, abbots and laundresses, looked for a moment less like figures in a ring, and more like doorways themselves, open to anyone willing to learn the step that says every foot weighs the same in earth's good ledger. The librarian, sweeping patiently, saluted them as colleagues and left a single crumb on the sill for the brave mouse that pays tuition in tidiness. When the bell lay its woolen thread for vespers, the village gathered with the relaxed precision of a loom that knows the pattern by heart. Inside, psalms moved with tide-like authority. The 2 tapers took their flame without chatter. St. Michael's half-eye kept the angle of hope. And in the side chapel, the last few letters, read silently by many hands, seemed to lighten as if attention itself were a kind of lifting. Outside, the pond rehearsed its moon, accepted 3 stars for balance, and declined the 4th as ostentatious. The mill, dignified by rest, allowed the round echo of prayers to pass across its door and settle like flour where it pleased. Dusk entered the valley with that second softer light the day keeps in a pocket for careful use. Along the hedges, a thin, attentive brightness gathered. Not news, never news, merely the competent that has learned its route. The watchman, punctual to the minute his heart measures, turned his lamp slightly away to make a space that did not insist. The prior, the librarian, and the novice came, as one comes to a friend's threshold, hands unbusy, breath at listening's key. The brightness rose at the river bend, as if standing from a chair it had borrowed from mist. It learned again the cursive of reeds. It hesitated at the plank bridge, the way a careful guest locates the mat with its feet before entering a room. It travelled not so much forward as outward, touching here, acknowledging there, finding the route it had made out of attendance rather than possession. At the widow's door, the new oil caught a thread of light and wore it like a modest jewel. Inside, 2 cups waited side by side, because habit, once taught, continues to be brave. She did not look toward the latch, nor away. She kneaded dough for tomorrow, and let the air keep its visit. When the brightness leaned to the pane, the moth's powder print, pale faithful signature, shone as if sealing a letter already sent and answered. The village dog, proprietor of thresholds, raised his head, sniffed the familiar rumour of mercy, and settled his chin again on the wood with demonstrative gentleness, as if instructing the dark to lie down without fear. Across the green, the bench felt a touch like a friendly palm. No argument troubled its planks. It remembered laughter and would keep it dry through winter. The repaired abbey step received a glimmer, as tidy as a notary's stamp. Bricks inside the mill found themselves inexplicably in good temper. The pond counted its stars and kept one in reserve for whatever the hour might ask. In the charnel house, wick and angle conspired to make the painted ring of dancers extend an outward hand once more, not to summon, but to accompany. Bone, masters of the level lesson, glowed with the patience that breaks panic and makes room for breath. The novice, unashamed of his bright pockets, asked in a voice trimmed to fit the air whether the light had a last errand yet to run. The librarian, rich in forgettings that keep truth free, answered that some errands finish by teaching us the right speed for walking home. The prior added only that doors need not swing wide to be open enough, and so, as if consenting to instruction from its own courtesy, the brightness began its turn, not withdrawal, never that, only the dignified arc by which companionship understands completion. It moved, plank to reed, hedge to bend, like a seam being tied with a final generous knot. It left behind no mark but better posture, latches a shade more confident, windows more patient, steps more exact beneath tired feet. When the bell stitched its single note across the roofs, the tone felt less like a command and more like a hand smoothing a coverlet on a sleeping child. Doors drew, too, with that small, devout sound the village likes. The hedges set their commas with care. The yew took in one last ink breath and kept it. The ledger, harbour that never chases boats, stayed closed and warm. The kind of keeping that promises opening without requiring it. The watchman, satisfied that door, gate, pond, and well could say their own names aloud if wakened, crossed the green with his small star of brass and the air of a man who prefers accuracy to heroics. And over the moor, where sentences grow long and refuse a hurried period, the rook wrote a modest stroke and put the sky to bed. In the widow's kitchen, she lifted one cup, then the other, and poured both back into the kettle, not as a surrender but as a promise to fill them again. Steam rose like a quiet rehearsal. The weaver and the mason parted at the bench with a handshake that remembered splinters and thread burn, and found both honourable. The pilgrim, already a little farther down the lane, held his loaf like a map that works in every country. The novice, going last, carried a calm that fit his pockets correctly at last. And at the river bend, where mist edits, where water signs its single syllable forward, the brightness rested itself in the reed's handwriting, a final letter for the night to post. Tomorrow would be All Souls in full. The valley's hinge turned all the way, but tonight, with lamps at peace, doors fluent in welcome, and names warm as stones in the hand, the village allowed the hour to settle, gently, exactly, and with a breath shared by pond and yew and step and loaf and ledger, waited in companionable dark for whatever blessing chooses to arrive when a place has practised opening by degrees. All Souls woke like a soft vow remembered upon the lips, and the valley took its breath. With care, the bell let down a single woolen note that did not so much summon as accompany. Smoke rose from the cottages in straight, well-mannered lines. Frost, having signed its name lightly on hedges and thatch, bowed away to the first patience of sun. The yew, steady archivist, breathed resin the colour of old ink. Beneath it, the ledger lay warm-backed and quiet, ribbon peaking like a small faithful tongue of promise. In the nave, 2 tapers waited, with that composed humility reserved for candles who know the hour is not theirs, and yet are ready to share its work. Along the lane, doors remembered the lesson of the days just past, to lift their latches without fear, to sit slightly ajar like a heartbeat shared. The widow opened hers, and found the newly trued lintel wearing mourning as if it had been tailor-made. She set a loaf on the sill for whomever the road might choose, pilgrim, neighbour, angel, or only the brave little mouse who pays tuition in tidiness, and tucked a sprig of rosemary into the crust as a green syllable of welcome. She placed her husband's hat on the peg with the tenderness one uses for a book one has finally learned to read without crying. Then she stood for a time, cup in hand, and let steam braid itself with kitchen light until the room felt companioned from inside. The watchman made his round. Door, gate, pond, well, speaking each name in the quiet grammar of a nod. The pond, satisfied with one daylight sky and the memory of moons, offered a single ripple that travelled until it forgot its purpose and found rest. At the bench, the weaver and the mason took their places like punctuation returning to a sentence. They agreed without argument that mending had its own liturgy. Doors before thresholds, stitches before songs. The mason promised one last, attentive tap at the abbey step. The weaver folded a length of practical mercy into her basket, a cloth the colour of field paths and good intentions. By mid-morning, the village walked toward the churchyard in a procession so modest it might have been mistaken for errands, sprigs of rue and tansy, a feather bookmarked in a psalm, a child's drawing of 2 circles touching. The prior said very little, which is how some blessings are best endured. He only lifted his hand, not to command, but to notice, and spoke the valley's simple theology, the one that had been rehearsing itself all week. Names are doors, and the heart learns to go through them both ways. All Saints lends its wide sleeve to All Souls. Keeping and letting go are neighbours who share herbs over a wall. The words did not instruct so much as agree with what everyone already knew in their bones, which were, by the lamp's low doctrine, equal patient teachers. They read the last slips of paper together, but not aloud. For a brother who could not stay. For laughter that returns without knocking. A tiny cow whose cough had improved in the margins. A star clipped by a steady hand and glued beside it. The librarian, who had decided to keep truth free by refusing to trap it in ink, slid the green rivered feather into the ledger and closed the cover as gently as a lid upon a sleeping bowl. The novice, whose pockets now held wonder in the comfortable way bread holds warmth, felt his earlier fears like old coats broken at the elbows, useful to remember, unnecessary to wear. When the bell stitched its noon seam across the roofs, soup rehearsed its mild sermon, and bread took notes. The pilgrim, salted at the cuffs with other countries, accepted a second loaf without protest, and left a blessing, in return, that had no address, and therefore fit every door. The weaver's cloth found a lap that needed mending only to remember how to speak. The mason's mallet said one last syllable into the abbey step, and then rested on the bench like a word that had chosen to be quiet for the remainder of the paragraph. Afternoon learned the long vowel of peace. Children, having exhausted the stricter business of rituals, launched leaf boats upon the pond and appointed their cargo of imaginary saints to new employments as ferrymen and weather readers. A fox stitched the field's hem with amber thread and left not a knot. A rook wrote 3 strokes into a sky that was already practicing dusk, and, satisfied with its penmanship, folded its wings. In the charnel house, the lamp kept steady school. The painted dancers, kings and millers, abbots and laundresses, by the permission of angle and time, seemed almost to step outward, offering not summons but accompaniment. Bone taught its equal lesson without scolding. Humility shortened fear to its proper size. Evening came dressed in the colour of quiet tea. Lamps woke, small brave planets cupped in glass. The hedges set commas where lanes asked to breathe. Doors rested upon their well-oiled hinges like hearts between beats. The prior, the librarian, and the novice walked the familiar path toward the river bend, with sleeves for company and no plan beyond presence. The watchman arrived by his sensible arithmetic. Even the weaver and the mason found themselves wandering that way, as if argument had been waiting all along to become simply fellowship. And at the seam where reed becomes air, where mist keeps its courteous desk, a thread of brightness rose, no larger than a thought, but exactly as real. It did not hurry. It did not insist. It behaved as attendance behaves, offered without demand. The watchman lowered his lamp by the width of a breath so that room would be made without spectacle. The prior said nothing and allowed his posture to be gratitude. The librarian remembered the birch-bark handwriting. Where they meet, mercy grows, and decided once again to trust a truth that refused a cage. The novice, pockets correctly weighted at last, simply breathed and found the night breathing back at him like a neighbour pleased by company. The brightness considered the plank bridge as a careful guest, locates the mat. It leaned once toward the village, once toward the brook, and once toward the reeds, an equal courtesy, like a threefold bow. At the widow's door, the new oil caught a small thread of light. Inside, 2 cups waited, not as a test, but as a custom. She did not look up. She let the air do the noticing, and the moth's old powder print on the glass glowed faintly, as if a letter sent months ago were at last being read aloud in a room that knew how to listen. The bench felt a friendly palm and remembered every kind argument that had ever rested there. The abbey step wore its glimmer like a notary's stamp. The pond counted exactly enough stars to keep courage company and refused the rest from vanity. In the charnel house, wick and angle conspired once more, and the painted ring widened as if to include any who might be standing hesitantly at the door, commoners of breath and bone, all of us students of a gentle equality. No one asked the light its name. Some blessings are best left unclaimed, so they can fit every pocket. When it had kept company to sufficiency, no more, no less, it began, with that obedient modesty it had taught them, the dignified turn by which companionship becomes completion. Plank to read, hedge to bend, it moved like a seam being tied off with a generous knot, leaving behind better posture, doors content to rest a little open, latches that remembered trust, faces softened as if grief had learned a slower syllable. Nothing vanished, something finished, and the finishing felt like a hand smoothing a coverlet, like a bell setting its single note across the roofs and then letting silence be silk again. The village walked home by ones and twos. The watchman counted door, gate, pond, well, and found them all able to say their own names if wakened. The weaver and the mason shook hands over a bench that would endure winter politely. The widow lifted both cups and poured them back into the kettle, not as surrender but as promise. The house had learned the shape of welcome and would remember. In the nave, St. Michael's patient half-eye was equal to the dim. Wax collars remembered summer without betraying frost. The ledger lay closed and warm, harbour that never chases boats and never forgets their names. The yew drew one last ink breath from the sky and kept it for pages not yet written. The pond, sensible pond, admitted the moon with a pleased shiver and made room beside it for a modest number of stars. And you who have walked with us along these hedges and through these doors, who have listened while reeds wrote cursive and bones held class without scolding, thank you for lending your breath to this quiet work. Thank you for standing at the threshold while a small light practiced being kind. Thank you for carrying names as if they were warm stones, and for letting the old quarrels wear slippers and share soup. If your own room is dim now, may your door remember how to open just enough. May your latch trust its vocation. May your window keep a gentle eye upon the lane of sleep. We've come to the last page for this night, but last pages, like thresholds, are only beginnings turned sideways. The bell has laid its soft seam, the ledger keeps its warmth, the yew breathes ink and patience, the pond holds the moon without boasting, and I, grateful for your company along these 20 quiet steps, will set down the lamp and let the room grow kind again. Thank you for travelling with me through the lanes where festivals become neighbourly and mysteries sit with their tea. Now, let the quilt of dark be smoothed. Let the moth's powder hymn the window. Let your breath find the village's slow, even key. Close your eyes, dear listener, and if night chooses to send a small, obedient brightness to your own threshold, may it find you ready, not to seize it, only to be companioned by it, until morning, warm as bread, remembers your name.